At dawn, Arthur Vale stood near Hangar 12 with an old blue toolbox at his feet. His old tools made them doubt him.
We will continue without your advice.
To Arthur, the aircraft was already telling a different story.
The right side sounds different.
Arthur trusted the sound. He had heard that pattern before.
They missed the first sign.
Hidden beneath the calm rhythm of metal and engines. Mara Ellison noticed what the others ignored.
What did you hear?
Arthur was not guessing. He was listening.
The pulse comes first.
Then he heard it again. A small change. A familiar rhythm.
There. That is the sound.
A warning no screen had explained yet. And before anyone understood why that brass mirror mattered, the moment had already become the beginning of the truth. Only later would that mirror matter. Later, people would understand what that moment meant. They would see the billionaire stepping over the old mechanic's mirror and recognize the cruelty in it instantly. They would understand that Julian Mercer had not only stepped over a tool, he had stepped over experience, warning, poverty, and truth. But at that moment, outside the fence of Hangar 12, nobody saw the symbol. They only saw an old man being dragged away from an aircraft he had no permission to touch. The only person who did not laugh was Mara Ellison. Mara was not an engineer or a mechanic. She was an operations coordinator, the kind of employee important men rarely noticed until something went wrong. She handled access badges, schedules, vendor records, inspection rooms, maintenance logs, and all the quiet details that allowed Mercer Aerotech to look organized from the outside. She had worked there for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between a company that talked about safety and a company that truly listened to warnings. And the look on Arthur Vale's face bothered her. He did not look like a confused old man. He did not look like someone trying to cause trouble. He looked like a man who had heard danger before anyone else recognized it. Even after Julian humiliated him, even after the guards dragged him away and his tools scattered across the concrete, Arthur kept looking past the people and toward the aircraft. That was what Mara could not forget. Most people, when insulted that publicly, would stare at the person who hurt them. Arthur looked at the machine. After security left him near the service road, Mara found him kneeling beside the curb, placing his tools back into the dented blue box one by one. He did not seem surprised when she approached. Men who spend their lives around failing machines often know when something is coming before it arrives. She asked how he knew about the right wing. Arthur did not give her a resume. He did not defend his pride. He only explained what he had heard. The engine note was clean, he said, but beneath it there had been a second rhythm, a small pulsing tremor that did not match fan speed, hydraulic cycling, or actuator movement. When the warnings appeared, they appeared in the wrong order for a software fault. Something physical was lying to the control system before the control system began protecting itself. Mara had listened to expensive consultants talk for 3 weeks. They used larger words than Arthur, but Arthur made more sense. Then she asked what would happen if Julian ran the test again. Arthur looked toward the hangar and said the aircraft would probably shut itself down again. But the repeated false response could begin stressing a secondary hydraulic isolation valve. If Mercer replaced that valve afterward, without finding the original source, the jet might pass one clean test and still carry the hidden fault into the air. That answer frightened Mara because it did not sound dramatic. It sounded practical. Inside the hangar, Julian was already demanding another run. Mara had a choice. She could return to her desk. She could tell herself she was not qualified, not responsible, and not brave enough to risk her job for a stranger. She could do what people inside large companies learn to do when instinct warns them, but their paycheck tells them to stay quiet. She could wait until the failure became undeniable and then claim she had never known enough to act. But silence, she had learned, was not neutral. Sometimes silence was only obedience wearing a safer name. So she brought Arthur back in. She did not make a scene. She used an old parts corridor, a canceled vendor badge, and a maintenance observation room no executive had visited in months. Arthur clipped the borrowed badge to his old jacket without even reading the name. He had spent most of his life in places where the label on a person's chest mattered less than whether that person could hear when a machine was in trouble. From the observation room above the hangar floor, Arthur watched the next test begin. Below them, the Meridian X7 came alive again. Dr. Evan Rusk, Mercer Aerotech's Vice President of Advanced Systems, stood near the main diagnostic station with the calm posture of a man who believed every room belonged to him. Rusk was not foolish, and that made him dangerous. For 3 weeks, he had guided the investigation towards software anomalies, supplier defects, and isolated sensor failures. He had dismissed early concerns about vibration near the right-wing route, not by destroying them, but by burying them under categories that made them look unimportant. Arthur did not know all of that yet, but he knew the type. Aviation had always had men who believed truth could be managed politically. They treated machines as if machines cared about schedules, investors, reputations, or titles. But aircraft do not care about any of those things. A hidden fault does not become safer because a billionaire needs a demonstration flight. Sooner or later, the machine demands payment. As the engines rose, Arthur placed one hand lightly against the metal frame of the observation window. He was too far from the aircraft to diagnose by touch, but vibration travels through structures in patterns most people never notice. Mara watched his face. His eyes narrowed before the first alarm appeared. He knew before the screens knew. Then the warnings returned. This time, a new message appeared beneath the others. The secondary hydraulic isolation response had delayed. Mara felt the air leave her lungs. Arthur had predicted it. On the hangar floor, Rusk immediately recommended replacing the hydraulic isolation valve and related module. It sounded decisive. It sounded expensive. It sounded like progress. But Arthur's expression tightened. To him, the new warning was not the cause. It was only the bruise left by the original injury. He asked Mara for the maintenance records from the last major modification near the right wing. Mara hesitated only once. Then she opened the files. 6 months earlier, the Meridian X7 had undergone a luxury cabin refit, acoustic upgrades, environmental system changes, and structural access work near the wing carry-through. The work had been finished ahead of schedule. Every inspection box had initials. Every approval line looked clean. Too clean. Arthur searched not for what was written, but for what should have been written and was missing. He saw vague language where precise torque confirmation should have appeared. He saw a late-night sign-off from a technician ID used on overlapping work. He saw a photo attachment briefly flagged as non-conforming, then marked resolved. When the photo opened, Mara thought it looked ordinary. Arthur did not. The image showed a vibration-dampening bracket near the lower right wing root. Beneath one edge sat a thin shim, a spacer inserted where the bracket should have seated flush. To a casual eye, it was almost invisible. To Arthur, it was the kind of shortcut that turns a small alignment issue into a hidden amplifier. Under light load, the assembly would behave. under rising thrust, vibration could travel through the shim, reach the nearby control feedback harness, and create a false stabilizer signal. The computer would believe the aircraft's tail surface had moved when it had not. The hydraulic system would try to correct a lie. The correction would create pressure disturbances and thermal echoes. The screens would show unrelated warnings because the aircraft was reporting symptoms from a hidden cause. The experts had been chasing ghosts. Arthur had found the grave. Then he saw the reference number attached to the retrofit kit, and his hand went still. Project Larkspur. Mara noticed the change in him immediately. Until that moment, Arthur had been focused, tired, and steady. Now something old moved behind his eyes, something heavier than a technical problem. Project Larkspur was not just a design file, it was a wound. 16 years earlier, Arthur Vale had been one of the best practical maintenance minds in an experimental aviation program, studying vibration and control feedback. He did not have the highest degree in the room, but he often found the fault first. He could hear a bearing starting to fail before a sensor trend caught it. He could feel through a wrench when a bracket was seating wrong. Back then, people listened. Then a prototype aircraft suffered a serious control anomaly during a storm approach. The official investigation blamed improper maintenance oversight. Arthur was the senior mechanic on paper, and paper mattered more than truth when frightened executives needed a simple conclusion. He lost his certification, his job, his reputation, and eventually the house he had shared with his wife, Evelyn. He tried to appeal, but records went missing. Raw data was withheld, and legal letters arrived faster than hope. When Evelyn became ill, he chose medicine over lawyers. After she died, the last person who fully believed him was gone. For 16 years, Arthur lived as the man officially blamed. Now the same family of vibration control ideas had returned inside Mercer's flagship jet, carrying the same kind of warning he had once tried to explain. Mara did not know the whole story, but she could feel its weight. She printed the inspection photo before the system locked the record again. Arthur took the brass mirror from his toolbox and wiped it with his sleeve. Then he told her they needed to open the right-wing panel before Rusk replaced the hydraulic module and buried the evidence beneath a false repair. Getting to the aircraft was easier than it should have been. In large companies, everyone assumes someone else has checked the person walking with purpose. Mara carried a clipboard. Arthur carried a toolbox. Together, they looked official enough to cross half the hangar before anyone questioned them. At the right-wing root, Arthur knelt with effort. His knee stiffened badly, but he did not complain. Pain had become background noise long ago. He loosened the panel fasteners and angled the brass mirror into the narrow space behind the structure. There it was, the shim. The bracket showed faint fretting marks where vibration had worked against the support. The nearby control feedback harness had a polished gray shine along its outer insulation. Not cut, not failed, but rubbed and compressed by repeated contact. It was exactly the kind of damage that could escape a standard continuity test and still corrupt a signal under load. Arthur did not celebrate being right. Good mechanics do not celebrate danger. Then Dr. Evan Rusk saw him. At first, Rusk did not shout. He did not need to. His body simply went still near the diagnostic station. His eyes fixed on the open panel, on the old man kneeling beside the right-wing root, on the brass mirror angled into the dark space where no unauthorized person was supposed to look. For one brief second, the calm professional mask slipped from his face. What appeared beneath it was not confusion. It was fear. Julian Mercer followed Rusk's gaze and turned toward the right wing. His expression changed so quickly that several mechanics stepped back before he even spoke. Less than an hour earlier, Julian had ordered the old man dragged away from the fence. Now that same old man was inside the hangar, beside the flagship aircraft, holding the kind of evidence that could turn an engineering failure into a corporate scandal. Julian crossed the hangar floor with security behind him. He accused Arthur of trespassing. He accused Mara of violating restricted access. He accused the mechanics nearby of allowing a dangerous breach near a multi-million-dollar aircraft. He did not ask what Arthur had found. He did not look into the open panel. He only understood one thing. A man he had humiliated was now standing too close to the truth. Arthur rose slowly. His knee made the movement difficult, and the hangar saw that too. He did not look powerful. He looked like an old mechanic who had spent too many years carrying pain quietly. But behind him, the open panel spoke louder than status. The shim was there. The rubbed harness was there. The fretting on the bracket was there. The aircraft had hidden the answer in plain structure, and Arthur had found it. Rusk stepped in with careful timing. He did not deny the shim. That would have sounded defensive. Instead, he framed the discovery as contaminated. Arthur had no active certification, no authorization, and no chain of custody protection. Once an unauthorized outsider opened the panel, Rusk said, no one could know whether the harness had been disturbed or whether any evidence inside could be trusted. Then he used the word that made the hangar colder. Sabotage. He did not say Arthur had done it. He only said the company had to consider the possibility. A disgraced former mechanic with a personal history involving aircraft control failures had entered the facility under false credentials and accessed a critical system area. The sentence was polished, cautious, and poisonous. A broken aircraft was complicated. A saboteur was easy. Mara felt the room shift. She understood what Rusk was doing. He was not trying to prove Arthur wrong. He was trying to make Arthur unusable. If Arthur became a contamination risk, the evidence could be delayed. If he became a possible saboteur, his warning could become motive. If Mara became the employee who let him in, her concern could be framed as recklessness instead of courage. Arthur had seen this kind of burial before. 16 years earlier, the words had been different, but the shape was the same. Improper maintenance oversight, failure to verify, inadequate detection, terms clean enough for reports, heavy enough to crush a life. Back then, men in quiet rooms had taken a complicated failure and arranged it until it pointed at the person least able to fight back. But this time, Arthur was not alone outside the fence. Cal Benton, an older Mercer mechanic, stepped closer to the open panel. He looked at the shim, then at the harness, then at Rusk. Cal had worked around aircraft too long to pretend the old man had invented what they were seeing. He had laughed earlier, not because Arthur was funny, but because fear and exhaustion had made him weak. Now he had seen enough. Cal said the panel should be photographed as found and tested before anything was replaced. Arthur's theory could be checked safely, without running the engines. A controlled vibration trace at the wing root, while monitoring the feedback harness and hydraulic response, would show the order clearly. If Arthur was wrong, the data would clear the concern. If he was right, the false signal would appear before the hydraulic dip. Rusk rejected the test too quickly. That was his mistake. In a technical room, speed can reveal fear. Another mechanic said the test would take less than 15 minutes. A younger technician admitted that vibration near the right wing root had been mentioned during the first week, but the concern had been redirected towards software. Someone else remembered an inspection note that disappeared from the active troubleshooting package after Rusk reviewed it. Truth entered the hangar trembling, but it entered. Julian sensed control slipping away. He hated it. But there were too many witnesses now. Too many eyes on the open panel. Too many mechanics beginning to understand that the old man had found the physical origin of a failure their screens had only translated into symptoms. If Julian refused the test, it would look like fear. So he allowed it, but only after warning that when the test proved nothing, Arthur would be removed, Mara would face consequences, and the company would treat the breach with full seriousness. Arthur did not react. He stepped back and let licensed Mercer technicians place the sensors. That mattered. He did not need to touch anything else. He had already shown them where to look. Now the machine itself would speak. The vibration unit was attached near the right wing root. The feedback harness was monitored. The hydraulic isolation response was tracked. The main screen displayed all 3 traces in sequence. Rusk stood near the diagnostic station, his arms folded, his face professionally blank. Julian stood beside him, ready to turn the old man's failure into a lesson for everyone watching. Mara remained near the tool cart, holding the printed inspection photo like a fragile shield. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The traces stayed calm. A few executives near the glass offices exchanged looks, already preparing to believe this had all been an embarrassing waste of time. Rusk's posture loosened by a fraction. Julian's mouth tightened into the beginning of satisfaction. Then the frequency increased. A small ripple appeared on the feedback line. It was subtle, almost nothing. The kind of signal that would have been dismissed as noise if no one had known to watch for it. But Arthur's eyes did not leave the screen. The ripple sharpened. The stabilizer feedback channel flickered, showing a disagreement that lasted barely long enough to register. 3 seconds later, the hydraulic isolation response delayed. Then the same chain of ghost warnings began to form in miniature. The order was undeniable. The false stabilizer signal came first. The hydraulic dip came second. The thermal spike came third. The room went silent. It was not the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of a lie losing protection. The aircraft had repeated Arthur's theory in front of the people who tried to mock it out of existence. The computer hadn't failed first. The hydraulic system hadn't failed first. The software had not invented the problem. The first wrongness came from the area Arthur had named while standing outside the fence. Julian stared at the data as if wealth could make numbers rearrange themselves. Rusk recovered faster. He said the result was interesting, but not conclusive. It still did not prove when the shim was installed. It did not prove the harness condition existed before Arthur opened the panel. He tried to pull the room back into uncertainty, back into procedure, back into fog. Then Mara placed the archived inspection photo onto the main screen. The same bracket appeared, the same shim, the same harness routed too close. The timestamp was 6 months old. Arthur could not have planted a shim 6 months before he entered the hangar. He could not have damaged a harness in a photograph taken long before anyone knew his name. He could not have invented the sequence that the vibration trace had just reproduced. The sabotage theory collapsed under the cold simplicity of time. Then Mara enlarged the approval section of the file. The final sign-off belonged to Dr. Evan Rusk. A low murmur moved through the hangar. It did not become loud. It did not need to. Everyone understood what they were seeing. The man who had dismissed the vibration notes redirected the investigation accused Arthur of contamination, and recommended replacing the wrong module, had also approved the refit record containing the very shortcut now exposed in the right wing. Rusk's face lost color. Julian turned toward him, not with moral outrage, but with the fury of a man discovering that the person beside him might become expensive. For Julian, the danger was not yet the passengers who could have flown on that aircraft. It was not the mechanics nearly blamed for a decision above them. It was liability. Headlines, canceled orders, investors. The possibility that the old man he stepped over would become the most credible person in the building. Before Julian could reshape the moment, the hangar doors opened. Helena Cross entered with 2 safety committee investigators and a legal observer. Helena did not move quickly, yet everyone made space for her. Authority looks different when it does not need to perform. Mara had sent her the inspection photo through a protected reporting channel minutes earlier, along with a note that Arthur's predicted sequence had been reproduced. Helena had spent years watching companies turn warnings into paperwork, and paperwork into delay. She knew enough to come in person. Julian tried to greet her with controlled surprise. He began explaining that the situation was complicated, that unauthorized access had disrupted the investigation, and that Mercer Aerotech was handling the matter internally. Helena listened with the patience of someone allowing a man to build his own trap out loud. Then she looked at the screen. The vibration trace remained displayed. The archived photo remained beside it. Rusk's approval line sat beneath the enlarged image. The open panel remained visible near the right wing. No speech could make those things disappear. Helena asked why the aircraft had been prepared for another test after repeated flight control lockouts. She asked why the vibration concern had not been elevated after the first week. She asked why a non-conforming bracket image had been marked, resolved without formal deviation documentation. She asked why the person who approved the refit had not disclosed the relevance of that approval during the troubleshooting investigation. Nobody answered quickly. That was answer enough. Julian tried to argue that grounding the aircraft without full executive review would create unnecessary panic and damage a major international sale. Helena told him that panic was not caused by grounding an unsafe aircraft. Panic was caused by pretending it was safe because the contract was large. The sentence landed like a verdict. She grounded the Meridian X7 immediately. No taxi test, no demonstration flight, no replacement of the hydraulic module until the right wing structure, bracket seat, feedback harness, and isolation valve were independently inspected. Helena Cross ordered all refit records preserved, all footage secured, and all personnel involved in the modification separated from the aircraft until formal statements were taken. The Meridian X7 was no longer a luxury product waiting for a buyer. It was evidence. Julian hated that word. Evidence meant the aircraft no longer belonged entirely to his schedule, his public relations team, or his money. Evidence meant order. Evidence meant timestamps. Evidence meant people who were used to being ignored could suddenly become witnesses. He tried to argue that the grounding was premature, that the foreign buyer would interpret it as instability, that the board would demand explanations, that investors would panic. But every objection made him look less like a leader protecting an aircraft and more like a man protecting a sale. Helena did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She reminded him that an aircraft with repeated control warnings, unexplained vibration traces, and a documented refit anomaly did not fly simply because a billionaire needed it to. The hangar listened to her because she spoke the way safety is supposed to sound. Calm, precise, and completely unmoved by pressure. Mara stood several feet away, still holding the printed inspection photo. Her hands had stopped trembling, but her face had not recovered. She knew she had crossed lines. She knew a canceled badge and an old corridor would not look clean in any official report. But she also knew what would have happened if she had gone back to her desk and let Rusk replace the hydraulic module first. The real fault would have been hidden beneath a false repair, and the next clean test might have become the most dangerous one. Helena seemed to understand that. She did not excuse the access breach, but she protected Mara as a reporting witness. That detail angered Julian almost as much as the grounding. He wanted someone punished quickly. Punishment could have helped him control the story. If Mara was reckless, then Arthur was a trespasser. If Arthur was a trespasser, then the evidence was contaminated. If the evidence was contaminated, then the aircraft could return to the language Julian preferred. Internal review, proprietary assessment, and temporary irregularity. Helena denied him that escape. Arthur listened without expression. He was not celebrating. His eyes remained on the aircraft. To him, the Meridian had not been fixed. It had only been heard. Men like Julian loved moments of public victory or defeat. Mechanics cared about what the machine would do tomorrow. A grounded aircraft was safer than a flying lie, but it was still a problem waiting to be understood completely. Dr. Rusk was placed on temporary administrative restriction pending review. He requested counsel almost immediately. He gathered his folder with careful hands and avoided looking at Arthur as he left the hangar floor. That avoidance told Arthur more than any confession could have. Rusk was not a man surprised by the evidence. He was a man surprised that evidence had survived. As the hangar began to clear, Helena approached Arthur. For the first time that day, someone with authority asked him who he was before deciding what he was. Arthur gave his name. Helena repeated it softly, and something shifted in her expression. She knew the name. Not from Mercer's current staff list, not from the borrowed badge on his jacket, but from an old aviation safety file that had never fully settled. Arthur Vale. Project Larkspur. The past, which Arthur had spent years trying to survive rather than explain, rose into the room. Helena asked whether he had worked on Larkspur 16 years earlier. Arthur confirmed it, but he did not offer the story. He had no desire to open that wound in front of Julian, Rusk's legal shadow, and half a hangar of people who had laughed at him before lunch. But Helena already understood enough. Years earlier, an independent review had questioned parts of the Larkspur finding, though the record had never been fully reopened because key raw data was missing and the original company had collapsed into asset transfers. Arthur's hand tightened around the toolbox handle. For 16 years, the official world had treated him as a concluded matter, a failed mechanic, a revoked license, a cautionary footnote. Now someone was saying the conclusion had been questioned, not in rumors, but in review. Did not feel like triumph. It felt like grief arriving late with documents in its hands. Mara looked from Helena to Arthur and understood that the old man's connection to the Meridian was deeper than instinct. The failure inside the modern jet was echoing the failure that had destroyed his life. Helena ordered her team to pull every Mercer archive connected to Larkspur-derived architecture. Julian objected immediately, using words like proprietary limits, acquisition complexity, and irrelevant history. Helena did not argue emotionally. She simply stated, that if Larkspur-derived systems appeared in the Meridian X7's control feedback design, then historical warnings were relevant to an active grounding. That ended the objection for the moment. But the real fight had only begun. Mercer Aerotech became quieter, and that quiet worried Mara more than shouting would have. The public relations team drafted careful language about a temporary safety pause. Legal counsel began separating documents into categories. Executives stopped speaking freely in hallways. Mechanics who had been ignored for weeks suddenly found their old notes requested by investigators. The hangar was no longer only a place where a jet had failed. It was a place where blame was being assigned, and everyone understood that powerful people would try to send it downward if they could. Arthur was taken to a glass conference room for a formal statement. The room had a long table, polished walls, and framed photographs of Mercer aircraft in perfect flight. Arthur sat at one end with his toolbox on the floor beside him. A security manager suggested removing it. Helena quietly told him not to. She may not have understood every tool in that box, but she understood enough to know that some objects are not weapons. They are the last proof of a life other people tried to erase. Mara sat nearby, pale but steady. She knew her job might not survive. She also knew that if Arthur had been right about the aircraft, then bringing him inside had not been recklessness. It had been the only reason the truth reached the panel before the false repair did. The questions began with what Arthur heard at the fence, what he predicted before the second test, what he saw in the refit photo, and what he found in the open panel. He did not exaggerate. He did not insult anyone. He described sequence, cause, and effect. That calm made his testimony stronger. Men who lie often decorate their stories. Arthur had spent a lifetime around machines, and machines punish decoration. One thing happens, then another thing happens. Because of it, the order matters. Then Julian's counsel asked about his revoked certification. There it was, the old stain placed carefully on the table. Arthur answered truthfully. His certification had been revoked after the Larkspur accident. He had appealed briefly, then stopped when his wife became ill, and the cost of fighting exceeded anything they had left. The official report blamed maintenance oversight, though Arthur had maintained from the beginning that the control feedback anomaly began before the event cited against him. Julian's counsel did not need to accuse him of anything new. The old accusation was useful enough. In corporate rooms, a damaged record can be used like smoke. It does not have to prove guilt. It only has to make people squint. Mara could not stay silent. She explained that Arthur identified the wing route before he entered the facility, before he accessed the records, before he opened the panel, and before anyone showed him the Larkspur reference. She explained that his warning about the hydraulic isolation valve came before the new warning appeared. She explained that the archived photo proved the shim existed long before Arthur was anywhere near the aircraft. Her voice shook at first, but facts steadied it. Julian accused her of emotional judgment. He suggested she had been manipulated by sympathy for a stranger. He reminded the room that she was not a mechanic, not an engineer, and not qualified to interpret aircraft systems. It was a cruel tactic because it dressed decency as incompetence. Arthur looked at him then. He did not raise his voice. He simply said that Mara had done what every safety manual claimed employees should do. She escalated a credible concern when the normal chain failed. If Mercer punished her for that, then the aircraft was not the only broken system in the building. For several seconds, no one spoke. Julian looked away first. That small movement did not restore Arthur's name. It did not fix the aircraft. It did not end the investigation, but everyone in the room felt the balance shift. The old man had not defended himself with anger. He had defended the person with less power. That is often how real character appears, not when victory is certain, but when punishment is still possible. By evening, the first version of the public story began leaking. Mercer's communications team tried to control it. They released a statement about an isolated configuration irregularity and a temporary safety review. They did not mention Arthur Vale. They did not mention the shim. They did not mention Julian's mockery at the fence or Rusk's attempt to turn the discovery into a sabotage concern. Companies often begin lying not by saying what is false, but by choosing which truths never enter the sentence. Then a financial news site published a harsher version, citing unnamed sources who claimed the Meridian investigation had been complicated by the involvement of a disgraced former mechanic tied to an old aviation accident. The article questioned Arthur's credibility. It described Mara's actions as unauthorized. It suggested internal experts were concerned about contamination, personal motives, and interference with proprietary systems. Arthur read the article on Mara's phone in silence. His name was once again attached to disgrace. For 16 years, he had lived under an official conclusion he could not afford to fight. The words were not new, but they cut differently now, because, for one day, he had allowed himself to believe truth might arrive cleanly. He should have known better. Truth often has to pass through mud before anyone admits it is water. Mara apologized, though she had not written the article. Arthur told her the company was doing what companies do when the witness is more dangerous than the failure. They could not yet defeat the evidence, so they were attacking the person who found it. But Julian had forgotten about his own cameras. Mercer Aerotech recorded nearly everything inside Hangar 12. The cameras had been installed to monitor workers, reduce liability, and protect company property. They recorded Arthur at the fence. They recorded Julian mocking him. They recorded the guards dragging him away. They recorded the tool spilling and the brass mirror sliding across the concrete. They recorded Arthur predicting the hydraulic warning before the second test. They recorded Rusk resisting the vibration trace, the archived photo on the screen, and the moment the room saw Rusk's approval line. The system designed to watch workers had watched the executives too. Mara knew where the safety archive copies were stored. Before her access could be fully restricted, she sent Helena the camera labels and timestamps through the protected reporting line. It was not a leak, it was preservation. There is a difference between exposing a company for entertainment and protecting evidence before powerful people can make it disappear. That night, Arthur returned to the small rented room above an old appliance repair shop where he lived. He had no real home in the way people meant the word. The room held a narrow bed, a hot plate, 2 shirts hanging from a pipe, old maintenance manuals, and a window that rattled whenever aircraft passed overhead. For years, the sound of planes had been both comfort and punishment. He could not stop listening to them, even after the world told him he no longer had the right to work on them. He placed the toolbox on the bed and opened it. The brass inspection mirror lay inside, scratched at the edges, its surface dulled by years of use. Arthur wiped it clean. In the mirror, he saw not only the tool, but the moment Julian stepped over it. He thought of Evelyn then, as he often did when a day wounded him more deeply than he wanted to admit. Evelyn had been the one person who never believed the official report. She had written letters, saved documents, and reminded him that losing a license did not mean losing the truth. Near the end of her illness, when Arthur had stopped fighting because medicine mattered more than lawyers. She told him that machines had always known who he was, even when men forgot. Arthur had not opened the storage box she left behind in years. Now he pulled it from the closet. Inside were old envelopes, faded photographs, unpaid medical notices he had never been able to throw away, and one small notebook wrapped in cloth. Arthur recognized it immediately. His shop notebook from the Larkspur years. He had thought it was lost. Maybe part of him had wanted to think that, because losing it hurt less than admitting he had been afraid to open the past. Between the pages, Evelyn had tucked a letter. Arthur unfolded it slowly. She had written it near the end, when her handwriting had begun to weaken, but her mind remained sharp. She told him that if the truth ever found him again, he should not turn away because of her. She knew he had chosen her care over the legal fight, and she did not want that choice to become another prison. She wrote that love was not the same as surrender. She wrote that if his name could still be restored someday, he should let it be restored. Arthur read the letter twice. For years, he had believed that choosing Evelyn over the appeal meant accepting the lie forever. Her words released him from a guilt he had carried so quietly that even he had stopped naming it. The dead cannot return what was stolen, but sometimes they can give the living permission to want it back. The notebook was rough, stained, and full of hand-drawn diagrams. It contained warnings about vibration-induced false feedback in lightweight control structures. It described dampening brackets, preload checks, harness clearance, and the danger of relying only on static testing when vibration was the real trigger. One phrase appeared more than once in Arthur's cramped handwriting. A bracket seated wrong can make the machine hear a ghost. The next morning, Helena's team found the first matching Larkspur file in Mercer's archive. It was an old technical memo, transferred during an acquisition years earlier. The memo described the same danger in cleaner language. It warned that a shimmed bracket could create a hidden path for vibration and make a control system believe a stabilizer had moved when it had not. Arthur read it in silence. The words were formal, but the thought beneath them was painfully familiar. Some of it had come from him. Years earlier, before the Larkspur accident, Arthur had written practical warnings after late-night tests. Engineers had laughed at his phrasing and then used the idea because it was right. After the accident, many of his notes disappeared from the official record. Now, similar warnings existed inside Mercer's archive without his name attached. Mara watched his face and understood the theft before he explained it. They had not only blamed him for failing to catch a danger he had warned them about. Somewhere along the chain, they had preserved his insight, stripped away his name, built new technology from it, ignored its limits, and then nearly blamed him again when the old danger returned. That kind of injustice is not merely professional. It is intimate. A man can steal your tool and leave you angry. But when they steal your warning, erase your name, and later punish you for recognizing the danger first, they are trying to decide who is allowed to speak reality itself. The first video clip appeared online later that day. It was short, shaky, and recorded by someone outside the service road. It showed Arthur being dragged from the fence while people inside the hangar laughed. The audio was poor, but Julian's posture was unmistakable. Viewers did not know the full story yet, but they saw enough to become curious. Why had a billionaire aviation CEO mocked an old man near a grounded jet? Why had the demonstration been canceled afterward? Why did the old man protect his toolbox like it held the last pieces of his life? Mercer's attempt to bury Arthur began to fail because curiosity does not obey press releases. Then the longer safety footage reached Helena's investigators. Within hours, the internal narrative collapsed further. The footage proved Arthur warned them before the new failure appeared. It proved Rusk resisted the test that confirmed the sequence. It proved Julian treated a safety warning as an insult because it came from the wrong kind of person. And when news of the archived photo spread inside the company, mechanics who had stayed silent began remembering things aloud. One refit technician admitted he had questioned the shim 6 months earlier. Another remembered being told the deviation was resolved above his level. Cal Benton submitted a statement acknowledging that workers had been trained, not formally but culturally, to stop writing concerns once leadership signaled impatience. None of them claimed innocence in a perfect way. That made their statements more believable. They had been afraid. They had been tired. They had survived by staying quiet. Now the aircraft had shown them what silence almost cost. Rusk was placed on formal suspension pending investigation. Julian did not defend him publicly. He began to distance himself with the speed of a man recognizing a sacrifice. He spoke of accountability, internal review, and his disappointment that critical information had not reached him clearly. But the cameras had already shown him ignoring the warning when it reached him in the plainest possible form. An old mechanic at the fence telling him where the fault lived. Rusk understood he was being prepared as the offering. That made him dangerous. Through counsel, he began producing emails showing the pressure Julian had placed on the Meridian team to maintain the demonstration schedule. None of the messages ordered anyone to install a shim or bury a warning. Men like Julian rarely write orders that way. They create conditions. They praise speed. They question delays. They make careers depend on impossible timelines, then act surprised when someone below them cuts a corner. Rusk's defense was not moral. It was survival. But survival has a way of dragging hidden truths into daylight. The two powerful men who had protected the same polished story began cutting each other with it. And then, late that night, Arthur received a phone call. The voice belonged to Raymond Sloan, a retired data analyst who had worked on the original Larkspur investigation. He was old now, thinner than Arthur remembered, his voice worn down by years of silence. Raymond said he had seen the news. He had seen Arthur's face. He had seen the phrase Project Larkspur return to public conversation. And for the first time in 16 years, silence felt heavier than fear. Arthur said nothing. Raymond continued anyway. During the original investigation, he had helped convert raw flight telemetry into simplified event timelines for the review board. The official summary blamed maintenance oversight. But the raw data, Raymond said, showed something different. The control feedback anomaly began before the maintenance event Arthur was blamed for failing to catch. In plain terms, the aircraft had started lying to itself before Arthur could have caused the chain they placed on him. Raymond had copied the raw data and hidden it. Fear had kept him silent. Guilt had kept him from destroying it. Arthur closed his eyes. For 16 years, he had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. He had imagined anger, shouting, relief, vindication. But when it came, he felt almost still. The body, after carrying pain long enough, sometimes receives impossible news, as if it is simply too tired to react. He did not forgive Raymond on that call. Forgiveness is not a switch old pain turns on because someone finally tells the truth. But he agreed to meet him because the data mattered more than the apology. The copy was held in a safe deposit box in Cincinnati under the name of Raymond's late sister. Helena arranged for an investigator to accompany them because chain of custody mattered now. The evidence had to be clean enough to survive the lawyers Julian Mercer could afford. Arthur traveled with Mara. In his jacket pocket, he carried Evelyn's letter. At his feet, as always, sat the blue toolbox. He did not need the tools for the meeting. He brought them because they were the only witnesses that had never left him. Raymond met them in a public library, older than Arthur remembered, bent inward by cowardice and regret. He did not ask for easy forgiveness. He explained what he had done, how the raw sequence differed from the summary, how his supervisor had pressured him to treat the anomaly as inconclusive, and how he convinced himself that reopening the matter would destroy his family without saving Arthur. Arthur listened. He saw a man who had failed him. He also saw a man finally bringing forward the one thing powerful people had kept hidden. Human beings, Arthur knew, were more complicated than machines. Machines fail according to conditions. People fail according to fear. At the bank, the safe deposit box contained an old data cartridge, a printed index, and a letter from Raymond explaining why he had preserved it. The cartridge looked too small to carry the weight placed upon it. But Arthur knew small things could change everything. A shim, a wire, a missing line of data, a truth kept alive in the dark. Helena's team extracted the telemetry with help from a specialist who could still read the obsolete format. The process took hours. Arthur waited in a small municipal aviation office with Mara beside him, staring at a framed picture of an aircraft lifting into a blue sky. He wondered how many beautiful machines had carried ugly secrets, because men on the ground were too proud to stop them. When Helena entered, she did not look triumphant. That told Arthur the truth had weight. The raw data confirmed Raymond's claim. The Larkspur control feedback anomaly began before the event cited against Arthur. The original report had not merely simplified the timeline, it had reversed its meaning. Arthur's maintenance oversight had been used as the clean explanation for a deeper design and vibration issue that management did not want to own. For 16 years, the report had treated him like the first failure in the chain. Now the machine from his past had finally spoken, and the report had reversed cause and effect. For years, Arthur had imagined that proof would feel like freedom. Instead, the first feeling was grief. He sat in the municipal aviation office with the raw telemetry summary on the table, and for several seconds, he could not move. The room around him seemed too clean for the truth it now contained. Fluorescent lights hummed above him. Mara sat beside him. Helena stood near the window with the expression of a woman who understood that official words could not return stolen years. Arthur thought of Evelyn. He saw her at the kitchen table, opening letters from agencies that never answered honestly. He saw the house they sold, when medical bills grew faster than hope. He saw the certification notice that ended the only work he had ever truly loved. He saw the faces of employers who read his record and became polite in the way people become polite when they have already decided no. He saw the apprentices he never trained, the aircraft he never signed off, and the nights when he woke, hearing alarms from a storm he had not caused. Proof did not give those years back. It only proved that the pain had been telling the truth. Mara placed her hand gently over his. This time, Arthur let it stay. Helena explained that the old Larkspur finding would not be overturned in a single afternoon. Institutions moved slowly, especially when admitting an old error meant admitting that real people had lived beneath it. But the evidence was now too strong to ignore. Arthur's notebook, Raymond's raw telemetry, the Mercer archive, Rusk's approval record, the Meridian X7 failure, the shimmed bracket, the rubbed harness, and the hangar footage all pointed in the same direction. A warning had been made. A warning had been buried. A system had been built from the buried warning. And when the same danger returned, the same kind of men had tried to bury the mechanic again. This time, they were too late. The deeper story broke the next morning. Nina Patel, an aviation safety journalist known for careful reporting rather than loud scandal, published the first full account. She did not write Arthur as a fairy tale hero or Julian as a simple villain. She explained the failure sequence, the physical evidence inside the right wing, the archived refit photo, the vibration trace, the Larkspur connection, Raymond's raw data, and the culture that allowed technical concerns to become inconvenient noise. Her headline described Arthur as the mechanic who heard the failure before the screens understood it. That line traveled everywhere. Pilots shared it. Mechanics shared it. Safety inspectors debated it. Aviation students began mapping the timeline. Ordinary people did not understand every detail of dampening brackets or feedback harnesses, but they understood the image of an old man at a fence, warning experts, being laughed away, and then being proven right by the very aircraft they said he had no right to approach. They understood Julian stepping over the mirror. That image became the symbol of the entire scandal. A billionaire stepping over the tool of the man who would save his aircraft. A company stepping over experience. An industry stepping over a warning because the person giving it looked poor, old, and inconvenient. Mercer Aerotech could no longer control the story. Julian tried it first. He released a statement praising the safety review and claiming the company had acted with caution once new information emerged. But the footage made those words look thin. The cameras showed Arthur's warning. They showed Julian's mockery. They showed the guards pulling him away. They showed Rusk resisting the simple test. They showed Julian objecting to the grounding because of the demonstration schedule. It was difficult to claim caution when the world had watched you treat caution like an insult. The buyer suspended the fleet order. Regulators demanded records. Investors demanded leadership accountability. The board, which had once celebrated Julian's speed and confidence, now spoke in colder words. Governance, risk, oversight, exposure. Men like Julian often discover too late that the people who praise arrogance during profit will rename it recklessness during crisis. Rusk fell first. Investigators recovered the private message he believed had disappeared. It had survived in an automatic backup attached to a project management export. In that message, Rusk had discouraged formal deviation language about the shimmed bracket because it could trigger structural review and create schedule exposure. The phrase was polite, corporate, and damning. It showed exactly how danger becomes paperwork when the wrong person is trying to protect a calendar. Rusk was terminated for cause and referred for regulatory investigation. His professional reputation, built on precision and authority, began cracking beneath his own words. He had spent his career sounding careful. Now everyone could see that careful language had been used to hide careless judgment. Julian tried to make Rusk the entire scandal. He described himself as misled by advanced systems leadership. He spoke of disappointment. He promised reform. He praised the employees who had helped identify the concern, carefully avoiding the fact that one of those employees had to bring Arthur through an unofficial route because the official chain had failed. But Rusk, facing ruin, refused to become the only sacrifice. Through counsel, he produced emails showing Julian's repeated pressure to keep the demonstration flight on schedule, despite unresolved modification concerns. None of the emails ordered anyone to commit misconduct in plain language. They did something more familiar and harder to prosecute. They created pressure. They rewarded speed. They punished delay. They made everyone understand what kind of truth leadership preferred. The two men who had once protected the same polished story began cutting each other with pieces of it. That was poetic justice, not because it was loud, but because it was exact. For years inside Mercer Aerotech, pressure had flowed downward. Executives demanded impossible timelines. Managers softened warnings. Mechanics carried the risk. Now the pressure flowed upward. The records used to control workers became evidence against executives. The cameras installed to monitor the hangar became witnesses against its owner. The old Larkspur files that erased Arthur's name became proof that his warning had outlived the people who stole it. While the powerful fought, the mechanics repaired the aircraft. The Meridian X7 remained grounded under independent oversight. Its right-wing panels were open, its harnesses were tagged, its bracket was removed. Its structure was lit by inspection lamps. Without the polished skin hiding its inner spaces, the aircraft looked less like a luxury object and more like what every aircraft truly is. A promise made out of metal, wire, pressure, tolerance, and trust. Arthur returned to Hangar 12 as an official technical witness. No one laughed this time. Cal Benton met him near the right-wing route. Shame sat plainly on the older mechanic's face. He had laughed at the fence. He had stayed quiet during the refit. He had survived in Mercer's culture by learning when not to challenge authority. Arthur did not demand an apology. He had little use for apology unless it changed what happened next. Cal understood that. He explained the repair plan with a humility that had not existed in the hangar before. The shim would be removed. The bracket seat would be restored and measured properly. The control feedback harness would be replaced and rerouted with correct clearance. The secondary hydraulic isolation valve would be inspected for stress from repeated false commands. The entire feedback loop would be recalibrated under staged vibration load, not only static conditions. Every aircraft that had received the same modification package would be inspected before returning to service. Arthur listened. He did not take over. He did not touch anything he was not authorized to touch. He had already been punished once by a world eager to blur technical truth with procedural accusation. This time, he remained careful. Licensed technicians performed the work. Arthur observed, asked questions, and gave advice only when invited. But everyone in the hangar felt the standard change around him. A young engineer asked whether the bracket preload should be verified again after the first vibration cycle, rather than only before panel closure. Arthur almost broke then. Not when Julian insulted him. Not when Rusk was exposed. Not when the raw data confirmed his old warning. But when a young engineer listened to his practical concern and wrote it down without making him prove that his experience deserved space on the page. Respect, when denied long enough, can feel almost unbearable when it finally returns. The repair took 2 days. They ran the vibration trace before closing the panel, then again after closing it, then again after the first controlled system cycle. The ghost signal did not return. The feedback channel stayed clean. The hydraulic isolation response remained stable. The bleed air spike vanished because it had never been the disease. It had only been the echo. On the final ground test, Hangar 12 filled with people in silence. The engine started. the sound rose smoothly through the space. Arthur stood several feet behind the main line with his toolbox at his feet, one hand resting lightly on the handle. He listened not for power, but for absence. The wrong pulse was gone. The right-wing root no longer carried that faint, false rhythm he had heard from outside the fence. The thrust increased through the range where the failure had always appeared. No stabilizer warning, no hydraulic dip, no thermal spike, no lockout. The Meridian X7 did not announce that it had been healed. It simply behaved. A quiet cheer moved through the hangar. Mechanics shook hands. Engineers exhaled. Mara covered her mouth with one hand. Cal looked down and wiped his face as if no one could see him. Helena watched Arthur, understanding that the moment belonged to him more than any press release would ever admit. Arthur did not smile broadly. His relief was deeper than expression. For the first time in 16 years, he had helped bring an aircraft back to truth in front of witnesses who could not erase him. The successful test did not save Julian. It made his position worse. If the aircraft had remained mysterious, he might have hidden behind complexity. But the fix proved Arthur had been right from the beginning. It proved the problem had not required weeks of executive theater, millions in unnecessary parts, or attacks on a poor old mechanic. It required opening the correct panel, respecting the first warning, and listening to someone who understood machines without needing permission from a billionaire. The board announced that Julian Mercer would step aside pending an independent governance review. They did not call it removal. Men with money often receive softer words on the way down than working people receive while falling. But everyone understood. Julian had built an empire on speed, image, and control. He lost control because a machine refused to carry his pride into the sky. Mara's suspension was lifted. More than that, Helena recommended her for a newly created protected escalation role, ensuring that non-engineering staff could raise safety concerns without being crushed by chain-of-command politics. Some executives called it an overcorrection. Helena called it overdue. Mara accepted, not because she wanted praise, but because she knew how close she had come to staying silent. She wanted the next person with a warning to have a better door than the one she had been forced to break open. The refit technicians who had raised concerns were cleared. Cal Benton submitted a statement, admitting that the hangar culture had trained workers to survive by becoming quiet. It was not an easy statement to write. It made him look weak in places, but it saved younger workers from carrying blame that belonged above them. And that was the first honest thing he had done in too long. Then came Arthur's hearing. The Aviation Authority reopened the Larkspur findings based on the raw telemetry, Raymond's testimony, Arthur's notebook, the Mercer archive, and the Meridian failure. It was not a grand courtroom moment. It was a modest regulatory office with a long table, cautious language, and people who understood that admitting an old mistake could embarrass institutions that preferred their past to remain settled. Arthur wore a dark jacket Mara helped him choose. He carried the toolbox anyway. No one asked him to. He brought it because some part of him needed the tools nearby when the world finally reconsidered the hands that had held them. Evelyn's letter rested in his inside pocket. Helena testified first about the Meridian failure and the Larkspur connection. Raymond testified next, older and shaken, explaining how the raw data had been reduced into a misleading summary and how fear kept him silent. Mara testified about the day at the fence, about Arthur's warning, about the decision to bring him inside, and about the way the aircraft proved the warning before the company accepted it. Cal submitted his statement, describing the repair and Arthur's diagnostic accuracy. Arthur spoke last. He did not ask the panel to pretend he had been perfect. He did not want a fairy tale. He wanted the sequence restored. He described the vibration concerns, the bracket preload warnings, the missing notes, the test night conditions, the raw data he requested but never received, and the official summary that placed cause after consequence and then called it truth. He spoke of Evelyn only briefly because grief was not evidence, but it was part of the cost. He explained that losing his certification had not only ended a job, it had removed him from the one language he had known since boyhood. The panel listened. Arthur had once spoken to rooms that were already closed against him. This room was not fully open, but it was no longer locked. When the questioning ended, the panel deliberated. Arthur waited in the hallway with Mara on one side and his toolbox on the floor beside his shoes. He did not pace. He had done enough waiting in his life to know that movement did not hurry judgment. Still, every minute carried the weight of 16 years. When the decision came, it arrived in careful language, as institutional truth often does. The original Larkspur finding would be amended. The agency acknowledged that the report had overemphasized maintenance oversight, while failing to properly account for vibration-induced control feedback anomalies that preceded the cited maintenance event. Arthur Vale's documented warnings would be added to the record. His professional standing would be restored for historical review purposes. His revoked certification, long expired under the original finding, would be reinstated in honorary status, with eligibility for supervised renewal if he chose to pursue it. The agency expressed regret. Regret. Such a small word for 16 years. Arthur lowered his head. Mara looked away to give him privacy. Helena did the same. Raymond covered his face at the far end of the hallway. Arthur thought of Evelyn, and grief arrived with gratitude tangled inside it. He wished she could have heard the decision. He wished it had come before the illness, before the house was gone, before shame became part of the air they breathed. But the truth had come at last. Late, wounded, imperfect, but real. And because it had come, the lie would not be the final thing written beside his name. Reporters waited outside the building. Some wanted anger. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted Arthur to condemn Julian, Rusk, the agency, and everyone who had failed him. But Arthur had spent enough of his life being used in other people's stories. He would not turn his pain into entertainment just because cameras had arrived. He spoke instead about listening. He said safety was not created by confidence. It was created by attention. It came from mechanics, technicians, inspectors, coordinators, and every person close enough to notice when something felt wrong. He reminded them that a machine does not care about titles, wealth, reputation, or pride. If a bracket is seated wrong, it is wrong. If a signal is false, it is false. If a warning comes from an old man at a fence, the warning does not become less true because the man's jacket is worn. That evening, the longer footage of Julian stepping over Arthur's fallen mirror was shown in a documentary segment about the Meridian scandal. The image became a symbol almost immediately. The public loved it because poetic justice is easier to understand when it fits in a single frame. Arthur saw something quieter. He saw the mirror. The next morning, he sat at the little table in his rented room and polished the brass inspection mirror with a soft cloth. Its surface was scratched. Its edges were worn. It did not reflect perfectly, but it reflected honestly enough. That had always been its purpose. It did not make hidden spaces beautiful. It made them visible. A week later, Mercer Aerotech invited Arthur back to Hangar 12. Not as a public relations ornament, though some people certainly wanted to use him that way. Helena made sure the invitation had substance. The company was creating a training program on practical fault recognition, safety escalation, and the danger of dismissing worker concerns. The young mechanics had asked for Arthur by name. He almost refused. The hangar still carried the echo of laughter. The fence, the guards, Julian's shoe stepping over the mirror, Rusk's sabotage accusation, all of it still lived there. But Mara reminded him that places do not become clean because good people leave them. They become clean when someone teaches the next generation not to repeat what happened there. Arthur returned. On his first morning as a training consultant, he stood beside an opened airframe in front of a group of apprentices. Some had degrees. Some had grease under their nails already. Some were young enough to believe modern diagnostics would catch every danger before human hands needed to. Arthur did not shame them for that. He opened his toolbox and placed the brass mirror on the bench. Then he placed Evelyn's letter beside it, folded closed, not for them to read, but for himself to remember why truth must be defended before people are forced to spend their lives proving they deserved it. He began with a simple lesson. A bracket can look seated and still be wrong. A harness can test clean and still lie under vibration. A screen can show symptoms without showing origin. A room full of experts can miss what one careful person hears, if the room has already decided who is worth listening to. The apprentices leaned forward. Arthur lifted the mirror and angled it into the dark space behind the training panel. In the small reflection, they saw what direct sight could not show. Hidden brackets, tight clearances, a road where vibration might travel. Nothing dramatic, nothing glowing red. Just the kind of ordinary place where danger waits when pride moves too fast. Arthur told them never to trust a closed panel simply because someone powerful was tired of waiting. Cal stood at the back of the room, listening. Mara stood near the door, now officially responsible for making sure warnings had a path. Helena watched from the corridor for a moment, then walked away without interrupting. The best reforms are not always announced. Sometimes they are practiced quietly until they become normal. Months passed. The Meridian X7 returned to service only after independent verification. Other aircraft touched by the same modification package were inspected. New reporting protections were created. Concern logs could no longer be buried by one executive's preference. Safety meetings began with uncomfortable questions instead of polished confidence. Julian disappeared from daily leadership. Rusk's case moved through regulators. Mercer Aerotech survived, but it did not survive unchanged. The company learned, painfully, that the cost of listening early is always smaller than the cost of being forced to listen later. Arthur never became rich. He did not want to. He did not move into a large house or become a celebrity expert with a glossy office. He kept a small room for a while, then accepted a modest apartment closer to the training facility because his knees were getting worse, and Mara insisted the stairs were trying to kill him. He complained about the move, but not very convincingly. On quiet evenings, he still heard aircraft pass overhead. The sound no longer punished him. Sometimes it reminded him of Evelyn. Sometimes it reminded him of the years that were gone. But sometimes, more often than before, it sounded like work still worth doing. One afternoon, after a training session, a young apprentice stayed behind. He was nervous, holding a report form in both hands. He told Arthur he had noticed a tiny vibration during a bench test, but he was not sure it meant anything. He was afraid of wasting everyone's time. Arthur looked at the form, then at the young man. For a moment, he saw himself decades earlier, standing in a room where his warning was treated as inconvenience. He saw the fence. He saw the mirror on the concrete. He saw Julian's polished shoe stepping over it. Then he looked at the apprentice and handed him a pen. He told him uncertainty was exactly where safety begins. The apprentice wrote the concern down. It turned out to be minor, a loose mount, easy to fix, no scandal, no headlines, no billionaire losing control in front of cameras. Just a small warning caught early, because someone had been taught not to stay silent. Arthur considered that one of the greatest victories of his life, because justice is not only when the powerful fall. Sometimes justice is when the next frightened person speaks sooner. Years later, people would still tell the story of the old mechanic at the fence. They would talk about the billionaire, the private jet, the hidden shim, the raw data, the exposed executive, and the mirror on the ground. They would call it unbelievable because people like stories where arrogance is punished and truth returns at the perfect moment. Arthur knew the truth was less perfect than that. Truth had come late. It had left scars. It had not saved Evelyn. It had not returned the house. It had not given him back the strength of his younger hands. But it had returned his name to him. It had changed a hangar. It had taught young workers that warnings do not become worthless because they come from someone without power. And maybe that was enough. On his final day of the first training cycle, Arthur stood inside Hangar 12 near the same fence where he had once been thrown out. The Meridian X7 rested in the distance, quiet and repaired. The brass mirror sat in his toolbox, scratched but clean. Mara joined him for a moment, and neither of them spoke at first. Outside the fence, the concrete looked ordinary. Arthur remembered kneeling there, gathering tools while rich men laughed. He remembered the mirror sliding through the dust. He remembered Julian stepping over it as if it were nothing. Then he looked back into the hangar, where apprentices were now teaching one another how to inspect the hidden places. Mara asked whether he ever got tired of telling the story. Arthur smiled faintly. He said the story was not about him. It was about the warning. Because every machine, every workplace, every family, every life gives warnings before it breaks. Sometimes those warnings come from screens, sometimes from numbers, sometimes from a sound no one else notices, and sometimes they come from a person the room has already decided not to respect. The danger is not only missing the warning. The danger is deciding who is allowed to give one. Arthur picked up his toolbox and turned from the fence. He walked back into Hangar 12 slowly, with the same worn jacket, the same tired knees, and the same careful hands. But he no longer walked like a man waiting to be removed. He walked like someone the truth had finally brought home. So if you ever see someone being dismissed because they look too old, too poor, too quiet, or too ordinary to matter, remember Arthur Vale. Remember the aircraft that warned them 3 times. Remember the billionaire who laughed. Remember the mirror on the concrete. And remember this: what you step over may be the very thing that could have saved you.
Stay down. People like you do not get to explain first.
Most people had already decided what he was.
We already know enough.
To the store security guard, he was an easy target. To the assistant manager, he was the perfect excuse.
I knew something was wrong.
And to the shoppers passing by with their carts and baskets, he was just an uncomfortable scene they could pretend not to see.
This does not feel right.
You should have checked the cameras first.
He noticed the manager watching too carefully,
The truth is still here.
and the young cashier looking terrified because she remembered the truth.
He paid. I saw him pay.
That camera was not supposed to see that.
My version is the one they will believe.
They thought the story would end with a quiet man being blamed, embarrassed, and erased.
No receipt, no proof.
But the man on that floor had spent years protecting records from people who thought power gave them the right to rewrite reality. And before the grocery store ever learned, it had chosen the wrong man to destroy. That morning had begun in the kind of darkness most people never noticed. Not the frightening kind, not the kind that filled headlines, but the slow blue darkness before sunrise, when working people moved through the world while everyone else was still asleep. Marcus had finished mopping the fourth-floor hallway of the Bryan County Courthouse just after 5 in the morning. The courthouse was empty then, except for the hum of vending machines, the distant click of old pipes, and the soft squeak of his shoes against the marble floors. At 52, Marcus Hale had learned how to move through important buildings without being seen. He knew which doors stuck in winter, which judges arrived before sunrise, which clerks left coffee rings on polished desks, and which hallways held conversations people assumed no janitor would understand. He wore a faded charcoal hoodie over his maintenance shirt, dark work pants worn thin at the knees, and black shoes that had been repaired more times than replaced. To most people who passed him during the day, he was simply part of the building's background, like a trash bin, a mop bucket, or a light that flickered near the elevators. But Marcus had not always been invisible. Years earlier, before the courthouse had reduced him to a man with a mop, he had worked in the records division, the quiet room where evidence logs, video files, sealed documents, and time-stamped materials were handled with more care than most people ever imagined. Marcus had not been a lawyer, a judge, or a man with a title people respected in public, but he had been trusted with something more fragile than reputation. He had been trusted with the record, and to Marcus, the record was sacred. He believed a time stamp mattered. He believed a receipt mattered. He believed a camera angle, a signature, a missing minute on a file, or a note written in the margin could become the only thing standing between a person and a lie that looked official. He had seen what happened when powerful people treated paperwork like clay, shaping it until the truth became convenient. He had seen ordinary people lose jobs, children, homes, and names because someone with a cleaner suit and a louder voice wrote the first version of the story. That was why Marcus had lost his position. It had happened 7 years earlier, in a case that almost no one remembered now. A young man had claimed he had been mistreated during a detention incident, and the entire dispute came down to a hallway camera file and the time written in the evidence log. The file showed one thing. The amended report suggested another. A superior had asked Marcus to correct what they called a harmless clerical error. The tone had been casual, almost friendly, as if changing a number by 14 minutes was the same as fixing a typo. Marcus had refused. He had not shouted. He had not threatened anyone. He had simply said that the time on the file was the time on the file, and that his initials would not sit beside a lie. In a place like Bryan County, that kind of refusal did not always create a scandal. Sometimes it created something quieter and more efficient. His performance reviews changed. His attitude was questioned. His ability to work well with others became a concern. Within months, the man trusted to protect records was reassigned to building maintenance, and the courthouse learned to speak of him as difficult without ever explaining what he had been difficult about. Marcus accepted the new job because he needed to eat, because his wife Ruth needed medication, and because pride did not pay rent. But acceptance was not the same as forgetting. Every morning, as he pushed his mop past the locked records office, he remembered the kind of people who smiled while asking honest men to bend the truth. He remembered how quickly a room could turn against someone who refused to be useful to a lie. By 5:30 that morning, the first pale light had begun to press against the courthouse windows. Marcus rinsed the mop, folded the cleaning cloths, and checked the small black notebook he kept in his back pocket. It was not fancy. Its corners were soft from years of use, and its cover had been taped twice. Inside were work hours, grocery costs, medication reminders, appointment dates, and little notes written in a careful hand. Some people used phones for everything. Marcus still trusted paper, especially when paper was kept close. On the top line of that day's page, he had written Ruth's kidney appointment, Naya's birthday, and a short grocery list. Oat milk, bread, soup, apples, Ruth's prescription, blue cupcake. The cupcake mattered more than the price should have allowed. Nitya, Marcus's 12-year-old granddaughter, had asked for nothing big that year. She knew money was tight. She knew her grandmother had been tired. She knew her grandfather counted bills at the kitchen table when he thought no one was watching. So she had asked for one blue cupcake from the bakery case at the grocery store near the bus stop. The one with the bright frosting and tiny white sugar stars. Marcus had promised he would bring it home after work. That was the kind of promise a man like Marcus treated seriously. When he stepped out of the courthouse a little after 6, the town still looked half asleep. The sidewalks were wet from an overnight drizzle, and the streetlights gave the pavement a dull silver shine. Marcus pulled his hoodie tighter around his shoulders and walked toward the bus stop with the slow, careful pace of a man whose knees had carried too much for too long. He was tired, but not unhappy. There was a difference. Tired was the body asking for rest. Unhappy was the soul giving up. Marcus had not given up. At home, Ruth would still be asleep in the recliner because lying flat had become uncomfortable. Nia would be getting ready for school, pretending not to care too much about her birthday because she did not want to make anyone feel guilty. Marcus pictured the cupcake in its little plastic container, imagined placing it on the kitchen table, imagined Naya trying to hide her smile and failing. That small picture carried him through the cold morning better than coffee ever could. The grocery store was already open when he arrived. It was one of those clean, modern stores that tried to make ordinary things look expensive. The floors shone under fluorescent lights. The produce was stacked in bright pyramids. Soft music floated above the aisles, cheerful enough to make the place feel welcoming if a person did not know how quickly welcome could disappear. Marcus took a basket near the entrance and moved through the store with the careful focus of someone who knew exactly what he could spend. He chose the bread first because bread was cheaper near the back shelf. Then soup, apples, and oat milk. At the pharmacy counter, he waited quietly while a young clerk looked through the bins for Ruth's prescription. He did not complain about the wait. Marcus had spent too much of his life watching people unload their impatience onto workers who had no power over the system holding them up. When the prescription came, he checked the price, swallowed the worry it gave him, and added the receipt to his notebook. Near the bakery case, he paused longer than he meant to. The blue cupcake sat in the front row, exactly where Naya had described it, bright and almost ridiculous beneath the cold glass. For a second, Marcus felt the weight of the morning lift. It was a small thing, but small things were often where love survived when money could not do much else. He asked for one, watched it placed carefully into a little container, and paid for it separately, so it would not get crushed under the groceries. The cashier who helped him was young, with kind eyes, and the nervous energy of someone still learning how to stand up in a workplace that rewarded silence. Her name tag was there, but Marcus did not need to read it to understand her. He recognized that look, the look of a person who saw more than she said. She noticed his notebook when he tucked the receipt between the pages. She noticed that he thanked her like her work mattered. She noticed that he did not rush her, did not talk down to her, and did not treat the small transaction as beneath him. Later, that would matter. At the time, it was just another quiet kindness in a morning full of ordinary things. But from the customer service counter, Victor Rowe was watching. Victor was the assistant manager, the kind of man who had learned to make authority out of a vest and a clipped tone. He was not the owner. He was not even the store manager. But he had enough control over schedules, complaints, and shift reports to make younger employees fear him and tired customers avoid him. He liked that. It gave shape to a life that had not become as impressive as he once imagined it would. Victor had been under pressure for weeks. Inventory numbers were wrong. Premium items had gone missing. Corporate had started asking questions in careful emails that sounded polite only to people who had never been blamed for anything. Victor knew exactly why the numbers were wrong. He knew which products had been moved, which small thefts he had hidden, and which adjustments he had made to keep suspicion pointed away from himself. But pressure has a way of making dishonest people creative. He needed a story. Not a perfect story, because perfect stories invite inspection. He needed a believable one. A tired older man in worn clothes, a small basket, a separate bakery purchase, a store full of distracted shoppers, a private security lead who already believed the worst about certain people before facts arrived. To Victor, Marcus was not a customer. He was an opportunity. Marcus had no idea he had been chosen. He paid at the self-checkout for the groceries, moving slowly but carefully, scanning each item and placing it into the bagging area. The machine gave him trouble once with the apples, and he waited for assistance without irritation. The young cashier glanced over, helped clear the warning, and watched him finish the transaction. Marcus folded the receipt and placed it into his notebook with the pharmacy receipt and the bakery receipt. Then he set the cupcake on top of the bag, like something fragile enough to deserve its own space. As he turned toward the exit, Victor stepped away from the counter. The moment was almost invisible at first. A manager intercepting a customer near the front of the store was not unusual. A security lead drifting closer from the side aisle was not enough to make most people stop. Shoppers kept moving. Carts rolled. The automatic doors opened and closed with soft mechanical sighs. Everything about the scene looked normal from a distance, and that was what made it dangerous. Victor spoke with the practiced calm of a man performing concern for an audience. He suggested there had been a problem. He implied that Marcus needed to wait. He did not accuse him loudly at first. He was too careful for that. He wanted the attention to gather slowly, wanted people to see Marcus held in place before they heard why. Because once a person looks detained, the crowd begins inventing reasons. Marcus felt the change immediately. It was not fear first. It was recognition. The temperature of the room seemed to shift, not in the air, but in the way people looked at him. A woman near the cereal aisle slowed down. A man with a cart full of bottled water glanced once and then looked away. Someone whispered without knowing anything. The private security lid approached with his jaw set and his mind already made up. His name was Brent Calder, though Marcus did not know it yet. Calder had the posture of a man who believed firmness was the same as truth. He wore a plain dark security uniform, but he carried himself as if the store had given him a kingdom. He did not ask Marcus what happened. He asked Victor what the problem was, and that told Marcus everything about the direction the morning had taken. Victor produced a bag Marcus had never touched. It contained expensive items from a premium shelf, the kind of goods Marcus would not have bought even in a better month. The bag appeared from behind the counter, as if it had been waiting for its cue. Victor said enough for people nearby to understand that he believed Marcus had tried to leave without paying. He kept his voice measured, but there was satisfaction underneath it. He was not discovering a crime. He was presenting one. Marcus reached for his notebook. That small movement made Calder stiffen. The security lid told him not to reach around, not to make things harder, not to act like he could talk his way out of what they had already found. Marcus stopped, not because Calder was right, but because Marcus understood how quickly a normal gesture could be rewritten by someone determined to see danger. He kept his hands visible and explained, as calmly as he could, that he had receipts for everything he bought. But calm did not help him. Calm often angers people who depend on panic to prove their version of events. Calder wanted Marcus defensive. Victor wanted him confused. The crowd wanted him simple enough to categorize quickly. But Marcus stayed measured, and that quiet steadiness made the accusation feel less secure. So Victor added details. He mentioned the high-value items. He spoke of prior losses. He hinted that the store had been watching people like Marcus for weeks, though Marcus had never been part of any such thing. The young cashier heard that and looked up. She remembered the self-checkout. She remembered helping with the apples. She remembered the folded receipt. Her face changed with the first sharp edge of understanding, but fear held her in place. Victor controlled schedules. Victor wrote evaluations. Victor knew how to punish people without making it look like punishment. She was 19, new, and not yet sure courage would protect her from consequences. Marcus saw her hesitation and did not blame her. That was one of the things people misunderstood about the quiet. They assumed silence meant weakness or approval. But Marcus knew silence had many shapes. Some silence was cowardice. Some was survival. Some was the terrible pause before a person decided what kind of witness they were willing to become. Calder stepped closer. Victor stood behind him. The store kept moving around them, but differently now. Shoppers did not stop in a circle like people in movies. Real life was colder than that. They slowed, stared, judged, and kept shopping. A mother pulled her child gently toward another aisle. An older man pretended to compare prices on canned beans while listening to every word. A teenager lifted his phone, then lowered it when Calder looked his way. The humiliation did not need a crowd gathered tightly around it. It only needed enough people to see and choose comfort over truth. Marcus asked them to check the cameras. That should have been the simplest request in the world. In a store with cameras above registers, doors, aisles, and counters, a customer asking for footage should have sounded reasonable. But lies do not like neutral witnesses. Victor's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Calder dismissed the request as if it were a trick. He said the matter was already clear enough, and Victor nodded too quickly. Marcus noticed that too. He noticed the nod. He noticed the security lead standing between him and the exit. He noticed Victor's eyes cutting once toward the freezer aisle and then away. He noticed the young cashier pressing her lips together, as if the truth were physically hurting her. Most of all, he noticed the small red light above the freezer case. It was not one of the obvious store cameras mounted in black domes from the ceiling. It was smaller, placed near a service panel, the kind installed by an outside maintenance company to monitor temperature access and after-hours service. Marcus had seen hundreds of cameras in his old job. He knew the difference between a camera controlled by a building and one maintained by a vendor. He knew that sometimes the most important witness was the one powerful people forgot existed. For the first time that morning, Victor had chosen the wrong man. Not because Marcus was rich, he was not. Not because Marcus had influence, he had very little. Not because anyone in that store was ready to protect him. Most were not. Victor had chosen the wrong man because Marcus understood records the way other people understood weather. He could feel when a story was being built against him. He knew where to look for the thing that would survive after voices finished lying. Still, knowledge did not save him from shame. Calder's voice grew harder. Victor's expression became more wounded and official, as if he were the victim of Marcus's refusal to accept guilt. The cupcake slipped from the top of the grocery bag during the confusion and landed near the wheel of a shopping cart. No one meant to crush it, or maybe no one cared enough to stop it from being crushed. The little blue frosting smeared across the clear plastic lid, and for one painful second, Marcus thought not of the accusation, not of the security guard, not of the watching shoppers, but of Nia. He had promised her. That was the detail that almost broke him. Not the embarrassment, not the way people looked at him, not even the false accusation. Marcus had survived worse things than public judgment. But the cupcake on the floor, bright blue and ruined under fluorescent light, carried a cruelty no report would ever capture. It was proof that lies do not only attack the accused, they reach outward. They touch birthdays, kitchens, sick wives, children waiting at home, and every small hope a tired person has carried through the morning. Marcus lowered his eyes, not in surrender, but to steady himself. He had learned long ago that anger, when displayed by the wrong person in the wrong room, becomes evidence for the other side. So he swallowed it. He let his breathing slow. He kept his face as calm as he could, while the people around him mistook restraint for guilt. Inside, however, he was already preserving the morning, the time, the aisle, the position of the cupcake, the order of the receipts, the camera above the freezer, the cashier's face, Victor's glance, Calder's words. A record could begin in the mind before it reached paper. By the time Marcus was finally led away from the front of the store and into the small back office, the public part of the humiliation had already done its damage. People would remember him as the man stopped near the exit. Some would tell themselves they had seen stolen goods, though they had only seen a bag Victor produced. Others would remember the security guard's confidence and mistake it for proof. A few would feel uneasy later, maybe while unloading groceries at home. But uneasiness was not the same as testimony. In the back office, Victor's performance changed. Without the shoppers nearby, his concern became impatience. Calder began writing an internal incident note before Marcus had finished explaining. That detail mattered. A fair record listens before it writes. A false one arrives with blank spaces already shaped like conclusions. Marcus asked again for the cameras to be checked. He asked for the self-checkout record, the bakery purchase, the pharmacy receipt, and the freezer camera near the service panel. Each request made Victor more uncomfortable. Calder, however, treated the details as noise. To him, certainty was easier than accuracy. He had already decided which man in the room deserved belief. Marcus was eventually released from the office, but not cleared. That was another kind of cruelty. They did not need to hold him forever to damage him. They only needed to let him leave under a cloud, with his groceries disturbed, his cupcake ruined, and his name attached to an accusation that could follow him in ways no apology could fully undo. Victor kept the premium item bag. Calder kept copies of what he claimed mattered. The receipts Marcus had placed in his notebook were no longer where they had been. That was when the morning became more than humiliation. Marcus noticed the missing receipts before he reached the bus stop. He stood under the gray morning sky with the grocery bag hanging from one hand and the ruined cupcake container in the other. His fingers moved through the notebook once, then again, slowly. The pharmacy slip was still there, tucked between 2 pages. The small list was still there. But the grocery receipt and bakery receipt were gone. For a moment, he simply stood still. A younger man might have rushed back into the store. An angrier man might have shouted. A more naive man might have assumed it was a mistake. Marcus did none of those things. He looked back at the bright entrance, at the shoppers moving in and out as if nothing important had happened there. And he understood that the story had not ended when they let him walk away. It had just become harder to prove. He took out his pen and wrote down the time. That was the first thing Marcus did. Standing beneath the bus stop shelter with the ruined cupcake in one hand and the grocery bag in the other. He wrote the hour, the weather, the number of the checkout lane, the color of the manager's vest, the position of the freezer camera, and the exact moment he realized the receipts were missing. He did not write with trembling anger. He wrote with the careful discipline of a man who had learned that memory becomes stronger when it is anchored to details. The bus came 10 minutes later. Marcus sat near the back, holding the grocery bag close to his knees. People boarded around him with their phones, lunch bags, tired faces, and ordinary morning thoughts. No one knew that the man in the faded hoodie had just been publicly accused, humiliated, and quietly robbed of the very proof that could clear him. That was another cruelty of injustice. The world did not stop for it. Traffic moved. Coffee was poured. School doors opened. People complained about weather and schedules, while someone else's life had already been pushed off balance. Marcus kept looking at the cupcake. The plastic container had cracked on one corner. The blue frosting had smeared against the lid, and the little white sugar stars were pressed into a shapeless mess. It was still technically a cupcake, but it no longer looked like something a grandfather could place proudly in front of a birthday girl. It looked like evidence of carelessness, as if he had failed at the one small thing Nia had asked from him. That thought hurt more than the accusation. When Marcus reached the apartment, the sun had risen enough to make the windows look pale. Ruth was awake in the recliner, wrapped in the old brown blanket she insisted was still good, even though the edges had begun to fray. Illness had made her movement slower, but it had not taken the sharpness from her eyes. She knew Marcus's face before he said anything. Wives who have survived hard years learn to read silence the way others read headlines. Nia was at the kitchen table with her backpack open and one shoe untied. pretending to study a worksheet while secretly watching the door. She was trying to act older than 12. Children in houses with medical bills often learn that trick early. They learn to make their hopes smaller, to ask for less, to smile quickly when adults look tired. But when she saw the damaged cupcake container in Marcus's hand, the pretending fell away. Marcus placed the groceries on the table gently. He apologized without making excuses. He told Nia that something had happened at the store, that the cupcake had been damaged, and that he would make it right. He did not tell the whole story immediately. Not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he could not bear to place the ugliness of that morning directly into her birthday, before she had even gone to school. But Nia saw more than he wanted her to see. She saw the way his fingers moved carefully, as if his wrist was sore. She saw the tightness around his mouth. She saw Ruth sit up straighter, suddenly alert. And she saw the black notebook on the table, open to a page filled with notes that did not look like a grocery list anymore. Ruth asked what they had done to him. Marcus could have softened it. He could have blamed confusion, policy, a misunderstanding, anything that made the world feel less intentional. But marriage had never survived between them on comfortable lies. So he told her enough. He told her that the assistant manager had accused him of taking items he never touched. He told her the security lead refused to check the receipts properly. He told her the crowd watched, and the young cashier looked as if she wanted to speak, but was afraid. He told her that the receipts were missing now, and that a service camera above the freezer might have seen what mattered. The room became very quiet. Ruth closed her eyes, not because she was surprised, but because some pain returns wearing new clothes. She had watched Marcus lose his records job years earlier for refusing to change a timestamp. She had watched people who barely knew him call him difficult, proud, stubborn, impossible. She had watched him take maintenance work with a straight back and a broken heart, because their family needed him more than his pride did. Now, years later, the same pattern had found him in a grocery store. A person with power had written a story, and Marcus had been placed inside it without permission. Nia did not cry right away. She stared at the ruined cupcake, then at her grandfather's notebook, then at his face. In that moment, something shifted in her. Childhood did not end all at once, but sometimes it lost a layer in a single morning. She began to understand that unfairness was not always loud enough for strangers to recognize. Sometimes it happened under fluorescent lights, while people kept shopping. Sometimes it wore a polite vest. Sometimes it spoke in a calm voice and counted on everyone else being too busy to care. Marcus wanted her to go to school. Nia wanted to stay home. Ruth settled the matter in the way she often did, with tenderness wrapped around steel. She told Nia that going to school did not mean forgetting, and staying home would not undo what had happened. Then she told Marcus to sit down and eat something before he started trying to carry the whole burden alone. That was Ruth. Even sick, she could still place order around pain. After Nia left, Marcus and Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the notebook between them. Marcus reconstructed everything from the moment he entered the store. Ruth wrote on a separate sheet while he spoke. She asked practical questions, the kind that forced memory to sharpen. Which register had he used? Which cashier helped with the apples? Was the bakery receipt printed separately? Where exactly had Victor stood? Which side of the freezer aisle held the small service camera? Did the security lead touch the groceries before or after the accusation became public? Did anyone else handle the notebook? Marcus answered carefully. He knew the danger of certainty when memory was still fresh and wounded. He did not exaggerate. He did not fill gaps with guesses. He marked what he knew, what he believed, and what needed proof. That distinction mattered. Lies often win by pretending confidence is the same as truth. Marcus had spent his life refusing that mistake. By mid-morning, Ruth had made one decision. They needed Grace Whitmore. Grace was not family by blood, but she had known Marcus long enough to understand what had happened to him the first time the courthouse turned on him. She was a civil rights attorney, with silver in her hair, patience in her voice, and a reputation for making institutions regret underestimating quiet people. Grace did not chase every rumor, and she did not make promises she could not keep. But when she believed a record had been manipulated, she moved quickly, because she knew evidence had a shelf life when guilty people controlled the shelves. Marcus did not want to call her at first. That was not pride exactly. It was exhaustion. He had been through the machinery before. He knew what it meant to become a case. He knew how people would examine his clothes, his job, his tone, his past, his finances, his family, and his anger. He knew they would ask why he did not act differently, why he did not speak louder, why he did not stay calmer, why he did not produce proof before the proof disappeared. Victims are often put on trial long before anyone admits a wrong has been done. But Ruth reminded him that silence had already cost him once. She did not say it cruelly. She said it as someone who had carried the same wound. The first time Marcus lost his position, they had tried to survive quietly. They had hoped that being honorable would be enough. It had not restored his title. It had not corrected the whispers. It had not taught the people who punished him to fear the truth. This time, Ruth said, they would not hand the lie a quiet room to grow in. So Marcus called Grace. He gave the facts simply. He did not dramatize the humiliation. He did not begin with outrage. He began with the missing receipts and the service camera. That told Grace everything she needed to know about the man on the other end of the phone. Many people call lawyers with feelings first. Marcus called with a chain of custody forming in his mind. Grace listened without interrupting. Then she asked for times, names, descriptions, and any proof still in his possession. When Marcus mentioned the freezer service camera, there was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. Grace knew the value of a camera controlled outside the place where the lie had begun. She told Marcus not to contact the store again on his own, not to post anything, not to threaten anyone, and not to let anger give them a distraction. The first move, she said, had to be preservation. Within the hour, Grace's office sent formal preservation notices to the grocery store, the outside refrigeration company, the security contractor, and the pharmacy system connected to the purchase records. The letters demanded that all footage, transaction logs, incident notes, internal communications, and registered data from that morning be retained. They were not loud letters. They did not need to be. They carried the quiet force of someone who knew exactly where evidence liked to disappear. That was the first turn in the story. At the grocery store, Victor received the notice before lunch. He read it once in the small back office. Then he read it again, slower. His face changed, not because the letter accused him directly, but because it named things he had hoped no one would think to name. The freezer camera, the external maintenance vendor, the transaction logs, the incident note, the preserved receipts, the time window. Victor had expected Marcus to complain, maybe to call the store manager, maybe even to shout into a phone and be dismissed as emotional. He had not expected preservation language. He had not expected a lawyer to move before the end of the workday. Most of all, he had not expected the camera above the freezer case to become important. That little camera had always annoyed him. It belonged to the refrigeration maintenance company, not the store's main security system. It existed because expensive freezer failures could ruin inventory overnight, and corporate did not like losing money to broken equipment. It recorded service access, temperature checks, and movement around the freezer doors. Victor had ignored it because it was not part of the camera system he usually reviewed. It was just another small device with a blinking red light, too ordinary to fear. Now he feared it. Calder did too, though he showed it differently. The private security lead did not panic. Men like Calder rarely panic in a way others can see. Instead, he became more certain, more rigid, more offended that anyone would question his handling of the incident. He told himself the matter would hold because Victor had made the initial complaint and Marcus had looked suspicious. He repeated that phrase in his head until it felt almost like evidence. Looked suspicious. It was one of the most dangerous phrases in the world because it often revealed more about the person looking than the person being judged. By the end of that day, the store manager had been informed. Corporate had been informed. The outside maintenance vendor had been contacted. The incident had moved from a small back office into email threads, where careful people began choosing careful words. No one wanted to admit fault. No one wanted to accuse Victor too quickly. No one wanted to believe that a private security lead had helped bury receipts, or that an assistant manager had created a false accusation to distract from missing inventory. Institutions rarely begin by searching for truth. They begin by searching for exposure. At home, Marcus waited. Waiting was harder than writing the time, harder than calling Grace, harder even than walking out of the store with strangers' judgment still clinging to his back. Waiting gave the mind too much room. He imagined the footage being deleted. He imagined the vendor saying the camera had not recorded. He imagined Victor explaining everything away, Calder doubling down, the cashier staying silent, and the story becoming another fog of maybe and maybe not. Ruth watched him pace the small living room until his knees started bothering him. Then she told him to sit. He did, not because pacing was useless, but because Ruth had always been better at making commands sound like care. Nia came home from school quieter than usual. She had told no one about the cupcake. She had not eaten the lunch Ruth packed. She had spent the day thinking about the way her grandfather wrote things down, about the receipts missing from the notebook, about the cashier who had seen the truth and said nothing in time. Children often understand injustice in simpler language than adults. To Nia, the question was not complicated. Her grandfather had paid. Someone lied. People watched. The proof had to be found. That evening, she sat beside Marcus with the damaged cupcake container between them. He had tried to buy another one from a different bakery on the way home, but the store had only plain vanilla left, and something in him refused to pretend replacement was the same as repair. Nia surprised him by touching the cracked container gently and saying it still counted because he had tried. Marcus looked away then, because grace from a child can break a man more completely than cruelty from an adult. He promised her again that he would make it right. But even as he said it, he knew making it right would not mean only replacing a cupcake. It would mean pulling a lie into the light. It would mean forcing people who had looked away to look again. It would mean entering the machinery he had spent years avoiding, and trusting that this time, the record might be stronger than the people trying to bend it. The next morning, Grace called. Her voice was controlled, but Marcus heard the energy beneath it. The maintenance company had confirmed the freezer camera existed. It had recorded continuously that morning. Better yet, the footage was stored through the vendor's cloud system, not the grocery store's local office. The store could request access, but it could not quietly erase the original. The files were being preserved. Marcus closed his eyes. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to breathe fully. Grace warned him that preserved did not mean won. Footage had to be reviewed. Angles could disappoint. People could claim context. Lawyers could make simple truths look complicated if they had enough time and money. But she also told him the camera covered part of the aisle near the freezer and part of the path behind the customer service counter. That was enough to matter. Maybe enough to change everything. 2 days later, Grace asked Marcus to come to her office. Ruth insisted on going with him. Naya insisted too, but Marcus hesitated. He wanted to protect her from seeing the worst parts again. Ruth gently reminded him that Naya had already seen the ruined cupcake, the trembling hands, and the silence after. Protecting children did not always mean hiding truth from them. Sometimes it meant letting them see truth handled properly. Grace's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. It smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and raincoats drying near the door. Nothing about it was flashy. The chairs did not match. The shelves were crowded. The walls held framed certificates, community awards, and photographs of people who looked as if they had once arrived there with their names damaged and left with them restored. Grace greeted Marcus with both warmth and focus. She did not pity him. Marcus appreciated that. Pity can make a person feel small, even when it is kindly meant. Grace treated him like a witness to his own life, a man whose memory mattered. She placed a folder on the table, then turned her laptop so the family could see the screen. The first clip was from the self-checkout. It showed Marcus scanning the bread, soup, apples, and oat milk. It showed the young cashier assisting him when the machine paused. It showed Marcus finishing the purchase and placing the receipt into his notebook. The angle was distant, but clear enough. Grace did not speak over it. She let the truth occupy the room without decoration. Ruth's hand found Marcus's under the table. The second clip showed the bakery counter. Marcus paid separately. The cupcake was placed in its container. The receipt was printed. Marcus tucked it away. Nia watched that part with her lips pressed tight, as if she were trying not to feel too much in front of adults. The cupcake, before it was ruined, looked bright and small and innocent. Then came the freezer camera. The footage was not beautiful. It was high, slightly wide, and colder in color than the store's main cameras. But it saw what mattered. It saw Victor near the premium shelf before Marcus ever entered that aisle. It saw him handling the bag of expensive items. It saw him place the bag behind the customer service counter, out of the normal customer path. It saw Marcus pass by later without touching those items at all. Grace paused the video there. No one said anything. Then she let it continue. The camera did not show every angle of the confrontation, but it showed enough. Victor brought the bag forward after Marcus had paid. Calder stepped in. Marcus reached toward his notebook, then stopped. The crowd shifted around them. The young cashier looked over from the self-checkout station. The cupcake fell. A shopping cart wheel caught the edge of the container and crushed it as the shopper moved past, unaware or unwilling to stop. Nia made a small sound then. Marcus reached for her hand, but his eyes stayed on the screen. The final clip showed the back hallway. It was not from the freezer camera. but from another angle Grace had obtained through the preservation demand. It showed Calder alone after the incident, holding folded slips of paper. It showed him place them into his pocket instead of attaching them to the incident materials. It did not capture his thoughts. It did not need to. Some actions are plain enough when placed beside the truth they were meant to hide. Grace closed the laptop. The office felt different after that. Not triumphant. Not yet. Truth, when finally seen, does not always bring immediate joy. Sometimes it brings grief first, because it proves the pain was real, the suspicion was manufactured, and the humiliation did not have to happen. Ruth was the first to speak, but her words were less a question than a verdict. They had known it. Now the record knew it too. Marcus sat very still. For years, people had told him in different ways that records were cold things, that paperwork had no soul, that video could not understand dignity, that timestamps were technical details. But in Grace's office, watching the lie unravel frame by frame, Marcus felt again why he had once sacrificed his position over 14 minutes. The record could not love him. It could not comfort Nia. It could not undo Ruth's worry or restore the cupcake. But it could refuse to forget. And sometimes refusing to forget is where justice begins. Grace explained the next steps. They would not simply release the most shocking clip and hope public anger did the rest. That was how stories became noise. They would build the timeline first. The self-checkout receipt, the bakery purchase, the pharmacy record, the freezer camera, the back hallway footage, the missing slips, the internal note written before Marcus's explanation was complete, the cashier's statement, if she could find the courage to give one, the prior inventory discrepancies connected to Victor. Marcus listened carefully. He was relieved, but he was not naive. He knew the other side would respond. Victor would claim confusion. Calder would claim procedure. Corporate would claim concern. Someone would say the footage lacked context, even though the whole lie had depended on denying context in the first place. Someone would say Marcus should have been more cooperative. Someone would say the security lead was only doing his job. Someone would say mistakes happen. Grace knew all of that too. That was why she looked at Marcus and told him they would not let the case become a debate about his attitude. They would make it about the record, not feelings first, not outrage first. The record first. Because once the record was clear, the feelings would know where to stand. Before they left the office, Nia asked if the video meant everyone would believe him now. It was the kind of question only a child could ask with such painful innocence. Grace did not lie to her. She said some people believe truth when they see it. Some people resist it because it costs them something. And some people only believe it when everyone else does. That was why truth needed witnesses, documents, pressure, and courage all at once. Nia nodded as if she understood more than anyone wanted her to. On the way home, Marcus looked out the bus window at the grocery store when they passed it. Through the glass, he could see shoppers moving under bright lights, pushing carts, comparing prices, choosing cereal, buying flowers, living inside the comfort of ordinary errands. The building looked the same. That bothered him for reasons he could not fully explain. A place where a lie had been built should have looked different afterward. It should have carried a mark. But buildings rarely confess. People have to make them. That night, Grace began preparing the release. Not a reckless post. Not an emotional accusation thrown into the internet. A structured statement with timestamps, preserved footage, transaction confirmation, and a clear demand for accountability. She contacted the store's corporate office again, this time with enough attached proof to make denial dangerous. She contacted the security contractor. She prepared to contact local media if they chose silence over action. Victor did not sleep much that night. Neither did Calder. But Marcus did, for the first time since the morning in the store. Not deeply, not without waking once to check the notebook on the bedside table, but enough to let his body rest. He had spent years believing the truth mattered even when nobody thanked him for protecting it. Now, at last, the truth had begun protecting him back. By sunrise, the story was no longer just his memory. It was a timeline. It was footage. It was receipts. It was a young cashier deciding whether fear would own her voice. It was a granddaughter learning that dignity sometimes needed documents beside it. And it was a quiet man in a faded hoodie, standing at the edge of a fight he never wanted, realizing that the people who tried to erase him had left their own fingerprints all over the lie. Grace did not release the evidence that afternoon. She knew better than to throw truth into the world before giving it a spine. A raw clip could be twisted. A single angle could be questioned. A few seconds could become entertainment, argument, or noise. What Marcus needed was not noise. He needed a record so complete that every excuse would have to walk past its own reflection before reaching the public. So, Grace built the timeline carefully. She placed Marcus's notebook beside the self-checkout log. She placed the bakery receipt beside the footage of the cupcake purchase. She placed the pharmacy time beside the bus schedule. She placed Victor's movement near the premium shelf beside the moment the planted bag appeared at the counter. She placed Calder's internal incident note beside the video, showing that the note had been written before Marcus's explanation had been properly recorded. Then she placed the missing receipts beside the back hallway footage, where folded slips of paper moved into the wrong hands and out of the official story. By the time she finished, the lie no longer looked like a misunderstanding. It looked designed. Marcus sat across from her while she reviewed it all, his hands folded around the black notebook he had carried for years. Ruth sat beside him, quiet but steady. Naya sat closer than usual, not because she was afraid of the office, but because she wanted her grandfather to feel that he wasn't standing alone anymore. On the screen, the grocery store looked ordinary. Bright lights, clean floors, carts, a bakery case, people moving through their errands. And inside all that ordinary brightness, a lie had been placed like a trap. That was what made the footage so disturbing. No one had needed darkness. No one had needed an alley, a locked room, or a dramatic threat. The harm had happened in public, under lights, beside shelves of cereal and bread, while ordinary shoppers decided the scene was none of their business. Grace understood that this was the part people would recognize. Not everyone had been falsely accused in a grocery store, but many people knew what it felt like to be judged before being heard. Many knew what it meant for a confident person with a title to be believed faster than a quiet person with proof. Before releasing anything, Grace gave the store one final chance. Her letter was direct. She told corporate that the footage, transaction records, witness information, and preserved notes confirmed Marcus had paid for his items, had not touched the premium goods, and had been falsely accused in a way that caused public humiliation and emotional harm. She demanded a public correction, an apology naming the wrong, immediate action against Victor, full disclosure from the security contractor, protection for the cashier, and compensation that recognized not only the ruined groceries, but the damage to Marcus's dignity. The response came the next morning. It was polished, careful, and empty. Corporate expressed concern. They said they were reviewing the matter. They asked for patience. They claimed they wanted to avoid rushing to judgment, even though their employees had rushed to judgment when Marcus was the one on the floor. They did not name Victor's conduct. They did not admit the receipts had been removed. They did not apologize to Marcus directly. Most of all, they asked Grace not to release anything publicly while their internal review continued. Grace read the email once, then set it down. Marcus did not need her to explain. He had heard that language before. It was the language of institutions buying time, hoping fatigue would do what denial could not. It was the same kind of smooth language that had followed him out of the records division 7 years earlier, when refusing to change a timestamp had somehow become a question about attitude and teamwork. The words were different, but the shape was familiar. This time Marcus did not bend. He gave Grace permission to release the evidence. The statement went out that evening. It was not emotional in the way people expected. It did not beg for sympathy. It did not decorate pain. It laid out the morning with timestamps, receipts, preserved footage, and a clear explanation of what the video showed. It said Marcus had been falsely accused after paying for his groceries. It said a store manager had introduced items Marcus never handled. It said a private security lead had ignored available proof. It said receipts later disappeared from Marcus's notebook. It said the freezer service camera, forgotten by the people who built the lie, had preserved the truth. For the first hour, only a few people noticed. A local reporter shared it, then a community organizer, then a courthouse employee who remembered Marcus from the records division and wrote that he had once been punished for protecting evidence too carefully. That one sentence changed the temperature of the story. People began looking more closely. They watched the clip of Victor placing the bag. They watched Marcus paying at the self-checkout. They watched the cupcake fall and be crushed while people continued shopping. They watched the young cashier's face as she realized what was happening. And then they watched Marcus, calm, humiliated, and observant, noticing the camera no one else remembered. By midnight, the store's silence had become louder than any statement it could have issued. The next morning, news vans arrived outside the grocery store. Corporate closed the entrance for an hour and called it a security concern. Employees were told not to speak to reporters. Victor did not come to work. Calder's contractor announced that he had been placed on leave pending review. The store manager released a short message about taking the allegations seriously, but by then, the public had seen enough polished language to recognize fear wearing a suit. The cashier came forward that afternoon. Her name was Lena Ortiz. She was 19, still new enough to believe that doing a job well might protect her, and old enough to realize that workplaces often protect power before truth. She contacted Grace first because she was terrified of losing her job. Grace took her statement privately and made sure she understood what could happen. Lena said Marcus paid. She said she helped clear the self-checkout warning. She said she saw him place the receipt into his notebook. She said Victor had been unusually focused on Marcus before the accusation. She said she wanted to speak earlier, but fear had locked her throat. Marcus did not condemn her for that fear. He knew how fear worked when the person above you controlled your schedule, your hours, and your ability to pay rent. He also knew that courage delayed was not the same as courage denied. Lena had come forward before the lie could fully settle. That mattered. Her statement pushed the story further. Other employees began to talk. One remembered Victor moving premium items near the stockroom on previous shifts. Another remembered inventory reports that never seemed to match what workers saw. A third said Victor had warned employees not to question management decisions in front of customers. Piece by piece, the image of a concerned assistant manager collapsed. What appeared in its place was a man protecting himself by creating suspicion around someone else. Corporate suspended Victor officially by the end of the week. The word suspended did not satisfy Nia. She wanted stronger words. She wanted fired, exposed, punished, named. Marcus understood her anger, but he had learned that justice often moved slower than the wound. It did not mean it was not moving. Grace reminded the family that the first fall of a powerful person is rarely the final consequence. It is only the moment when distance begins. People who were once protected by institutions suddenly become liabilities to them. That was happening to Victor now. Calder tried to defend himself. Through the security contractor, he claimed he had acted based on the information provided by store management. He claimed Marcus had been uncooperative. He claimed the scene was tense. He claimed his decisions were reasonable under the circumstances. But the footage weakened every sentence. It showed Marcus calm. It showed the receipts. It showed Calder ignoring requests to verify the purchases. It showed him writing the internal note in a way that placed conclusion before investigation. The more Calder explained, the worse he looked. Grace filed the lawsuit before the public conversation could fade. The complaint named the grocery store, Victor, the private security contractor, and Calder. It described false accusation, negligent supervision, intentional emotional harm, mishandling of proof, and a pattern of conduct that allowed a low-status customer to be treated as guilty because it was convenient. But the most powerful part of the complaint wasn't legal language. It was the story of a man who had spent years protecting records from manipulation, only to be nearly destroyed by people who assumed no one would check the record. That part traveled. Church leaders repeated it. Local teachers discussed it with older students. Workers at the courthouse whispered about it in elevators. People who had once ignored Marcus while he mopped their hallway began remembering that he had been more than a maintenance worker. Some remembered him from the records division. Some remembered his quiet refusal to alter a time entry years earlier. A few remembered how quickly he had disappeared from that department afterward. Then came the envelope. It arrived at Grace's office with no return address. Inside were copies of old courthouse documents, performance reviews from before Marcus's refusal, all positive. Notes from after his refusal, suddenly critical. Internal emails discussing his lack of flexibility, a memo suggesting reassignment, and a copy of the disputed time entry request that had cost him his position without ever being called punishment. Grace studied the papers for a long time. They did not directly say the courthouse had retaliated. Documents created by careful people rarely confess so openly. But the pattern was there. Before Marcus refused to alter the record, he was reliable, precise, trusted, and professional. After he refused, he became difficult, resistant, and not a good fit. The words had been chosen to hide the truth, but the dates placed them under a light they could not escape. When Marcus saw the documents, he did not smile. Vindication is not always joyful. Sometimes, it feels like standing in front of an old wound and realizing it was exactly as deep as you remembered. For 7 years, Marcus had carried the weight of being quietly demoted, while others called it complicated. Now the paper said what his heart had known. He had not lost his place because he failed the work. He had lost it because he respected the work more than the people above him did. Nia read the documents at the kitchen table. This time, she cried openly. Not because of the grocery store, but because she understood that her grandfather's suffering had a history. The ruined cupcake had been painful. The false accusation had been cruel. But the old records showed something larger. Marcus had been paying for honesty long before she was old enough to understand the cost. The lawsuit changed after that. Grace added the old courthouse documents, not as a separate fight, but as context for who Marcus was and why the grocery store's assumption had been so wrong. He was not a man inventing a story after being embarrassed. He was a man with a documented history of protecting truth, even when truth punished him. The very quality Victor and Calder had mistaken for weakness was the thing that made Marcus dangerous to their lie. Discovery began. That was when the defendants lost control. Emails showed Victor had been warned about inventory discrepancies before Marcus entered the store. Schedule notes showed he had been alone near the premium goods before the accusation. Transaction records confirmed Marcus paid. Internal messages showed corporate employees worrying less about Marcus's innocence and more about exposure. Calder's incident note had inconsistencies that grew sharper when placed beside video timestamps. The more documents Grace collected, the more the defense shifted from denial to minimization. They began calling it a mistake. Grace called it a sequence. A mistake is one wrong turn. A sequence is a path. Victor moving the goods, watching Marcus, producing the bag, ignoring the request for camera review, allowing the public accusation, and participating in the removal of receipts was not a single misunderstanding. Calder accepting Victor's version, dismissing Marcus's receipts, documenting guilt before verification, and keeping proof out of the record was not one bad moment. The harm was built step by step, and every step had a person standing on it. Victor broke first. In deposition, he tried to sound offended. He said he was protecting the store. He said inventory pressure had made everyone alert. He said Marcus had seemed suspicious because he moved slowly, kept looking around, and carried a notebook. Grace let him say all of it. Then she placed the video stills in front of him one by one. Victor near the premium shelf. Victor carrying the bag. Victor placing it behind the counter. Victor watching Marcus. Victor producing the bag after Marcus had paid. Victor looking toward the freezer aisle when Marcus asked for cameras. By the end, Victor's confidence had drained out of him. He admitted that he had handled the bag before the accusation. Then he admitted he had not seen Marcus touch those items. Then he admitted he had been under pressure over missing inventory. Each admission came smaller than the last, as if the truth had to be dragged out through his teeth. But it came. Calder lasted longer. He was the kind of man who had built his self-image around certainty, and certainty can become a locked room. He insisted he had acted reasonably. He insisted Marcus's calmness had seemed calculated. He insisted the situation required control. Grace asked him whether control mattered more than accuracy. He avoided the question. She asked whether he had checked the receipts before writing the incident note. He did not answer directly. She asked whether a person in plain clothes was easier for him to doubt than a manager in a vest. That question stayed in the room long after his lawyer objected. The case did not reach a full public trial. That disappointed some people, but Grace told Marcus that justice was not measured only by courtroom drama. After the depositions, After the documents, after the public pressure, and after the security contractor realized Calder had become impossible to defend cleanly, the defendants asked for mediation. Marcus did not want a quiet settlement that buried the truth. Grace made that clear before the first meeting began. No agreement would exist without public correction. That became the line. The final resolution came with money, but money was not the heart of it. The store issued a public statement acknowledging that Marcus had paid for his purchases, had been wrongly accused, and had been treated in a way that violated basic standards of dignity and fairness. Victor was terminated. The company referred his conduct related to inventory manipulation for further review. Calder was dismissed by the security contractor and later lost his license to work in private security after the review board found he had mishandled the incident and failed to preserve customer proof. The store agreed to retrain employees, revise accusation procedures, protect workers who came forward, and require immediate preservation of footage when a customer disputed an accusation. Grace also secured something Marcus had not expected. A correction letter was sent to the courthouse leadership, accompanied by the old documents and the public record of the grocery case. It did not force the county to rewrite history completely, but it forced them to acknowledge that Marcus's prior work and records had been professional, careful, and respected before the disputed reassignment. It also led to a small public recognition from a county oversight committee, praising the importance of evidence integrity and naming Marcus as someone who had upheld that principle. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. The ceremony was small. Marcus almost did not attend. He did not trust ceremonies easily. Too many institutions used plaques to cover the cracks they refused to repair. But Ruth told him that Nia needed to see the room say his name correctly. So he went. He wore his best jacket, the one Ruth had brushed twice that morning. Nia stood beside him with her shoulders straight. Grace stood in the back, watching like a person who had seen many victories and knew none of them arrived clean. When Marcus's name was spoken, he did not feel pride first. He felt the younger version of himself standing somewhere inside him, the man who had refused to change 14 minutes, and then walked out of the records division with his future quietly damaged. He wished that man could have known this moment would come. Not because it would undo the loss, but because it would prove the loss had not been meaningless. Afterward, Nia asked if he felt better. Marcus told her the truth in the gentlest way he could. He felt lighter, but not untouched. There are some things justice repairs, and some things it can only honor. The public apology did not erase the grocery store floor. The settlement did not uncrush the cupcake. Victor's termination did not give back the years Marcus had spent being treated like a man who had fallen because of his own attitude. But the lie had not won. That mattered. The record had held. A week later, Marcus returned to the grocery store. He went alone first. Ruth wanted to come. Nia wanted to come. Grace advised him not to push himself. But Marcus knew there was a difference between avoiding a wound and letting it own the map of your life. He needed to walk through those doors again under his own power. The store looked the same and different. The floors still shone. The lights still hummed. Customers still moved through the aisles with baskets and carts. But near the customer service counter, Victor was gone. Near the entrance, a new sign explained customer verification procedures without naming the case. Employees glanced at Marcus with recognition, some embarrassed, some respectful. Lena saw him from the self-checkout station and froze for half a second before stepping forward. She did not offer a dramatic apology in front of everyone. She did something better. She treated him carefully, normally, respectfully. She asked if he needed help finding anything. Marcus thanked her. That was all. Sometimes restoration is not a speech. Sometimes it is the ordinary courtesy that should have been there from the beginning. He walked to the bakery case. There, behind the glass, was a row of blue cupcakes with white sugar stars. Marcus looked at them for a long time. The worker behind the counter waited without rushing him. Finally, he bought one, then another. Then a small box of 4, because this time he could afford to bring enough home for everyone. He paid, took the receipt, looked at it, and placed it into his notebook. At home, Naya laughed when she saw the box. Not because the old pain was funny, but because joy had returned to a place where humiliation had once tried to settle. Ruth made tea. Grace came by later with documents for Marcus to sign, but stayed for a cupcake because Naya insisted. They did not pretend everything was simple now. Ruth still had appointments. Bills still arrived. Marcus still worked hard. The world had not transformed into fairness overnight, but something inside the family had changed. Nia no longer saw her grandfather as only a tired man who worked before sunrise. She saw him as someone who had protected truth even when truth cost him. Ruth no longer had to carry the old courthouse wound in silence. Grace no longer had to wonder whether the system that punished Marcus would ever be forced to face even a small part of what it had done. And Marcus, though still humble, no longer moved through the world quite as invisibly as before. With part of the settlement, he started a small fund. He named it the Hale Evidence Integrity Fund, though Nia teased him for choosing such a serious name. The fund helped ordinary people preserve records quickly when they were accused by employers, landlords, stores, agencies, or anyone else with more power and better paperwork. It helped pay for copies, letters, legal consultations, and emergency preservation requests. Marcus did not want fame. He wanted fewer people standing alone under fluorescent lights while someone else wrote the first lie. He began speaking at community centers. At first, he hated it. Marcus had never enjoyed being watched. But he understood that his story could teach what his silence could not. He told people to keep receipts, to write times down, to ask for cameras early, to save messages, to notice who controls the record. He told them that documentation was not distrust. Sometimes it was protection. Sometimes it was dignity given a place to stand. Nia came with him when she could. She sat in the back with a notebook of her own, writing things down in a hand that looked more and more like his. Years later, Marcus would remember that more clearly than any news clip. Not the headlines, not the settlement, not Victor's downfall or Calder's dismissal. He would remember his granddaughter learning that truth was not just something a person felt. It was something a person protected. One evening, after a community meeting, Naya asked him whether he ever wished he had shouted that day in the store. Marcus thought about it longer than she expected. Then he told her that part of him did. Part of him wished he had made every shopper stop, every employee listen, every liar feel the force of his pain. But another part of him knew that anger alone would have been used against him. The world often demands perfect calm from the wounded and perfect trust in the powerful. That is not fair. But Marcus had learned how to survive inside that unfairness long enough for the record to speak. Nia did not like that answer. Marcus did not either. But truth is not always satisfying in the places where pain first asks for satisfaction. Sometimes the deeper victory comes later, when the lie has exhausted itself and the quiet details remain standing. Months passed. The grocery store changed in small ways. Employees received training that no one could dismiss as optional. Customer accusations required documented verification before public confrontation. Footage preservation became automatic when disputes were raised. Workers had a protected way to report pressure from management. None of it made the store perfect. No policy can. But policies are doors. And before Marcus, people like him had often been left outside them. Lena kept her job and eventually became a shift lead. She carried the memory of her fear with humility, not as punishment, but as instruction. When new employees joined, she told them that silence could feel safe in the moment and still become a wound later. She never used Marcus's story carelessly, but the lesson shaped the way she treated people. Victor did not return. For a while, he tried to describe himself as a victim of public outrage, but the inventory findings followed him. People who build lies often expect sympathy when the lie collapses on them. Marcus did not celebrate Victor's ruin, but he did not confuse mercy with denial. Victor had chosen a scapegoat. He had chosen Marcus because he thought a tired black man in a faded hoodie would be easy to doubt. The consequence belonged to him. Calder disappeared from private security work. That, too, was justice of a kind. The authority he had used to silence a man was taken from him because he had proven he could not be trusted with it. Marcus did not need to see him suffer. He only needed to know that the next tired customer would not have to face that same cold certainty from the same man. As for Marcus, he kept working, not because he had to accept invisibility again, but because honest work had never been the shame. The shame had always belonged to those who looked at the work and decided the worker mattered less. He still rose before sunrise. He still walked through blue darkness. He still carried the black notebook. But now, when courthouse employees passed him, some greeted him by name. Some looked embarrassed. A few even thanked him. Marcus accepted the thanks without becoming dependent on it. He had learned not to build his dignity on other people, finally noticing what should have been obvious. Recognition was welcome, but it was not the source. His worth had existed on the grocery store floor. It had existed when the cupcake was crushed. It had existed when the receipts were missing, when the crowd looked away, when Victor smiled, when Calder wrote, when no apology had yet arrived. That was the lesson he wanted Naya to keep. A person is not made innocent by footage. The footage only proves what was already true. A person is not made worthy by a public apology. The apology only admits what should never have been denied. And dignity does not begin when powerful people recognize it. Dignity is already there, even when the world refuses to bow its head before it. On Naya's next birthday, there were blue cupcakes on the kitchen table again. This time, the frosting was perfect. The little white sugar stars sat untouched. Ruth lit one candle because Nia said 12 had been too many last year, and 13 felt too dramatic. Marcus laughed at that, a quiet laugh that made Ruth smile. For a moment, there were no lawyers, no footage, no statements, no old courthouse documents, no grocery store floor. There was only family, warm light, and a child blowing out a candle in a room where love had survived the attempt to shame it. After Nia made her wish, she asked Marcus if he wanted to know what it was. He told her wishes should be kept private. She said this one could be shared because It was not only for her. She had wished that people would learn to check the truth before they decided who someone was. Marcus looked at Ruth then, and Ruth looked back at him with tears in her eyes, because that was the kind of wish no child should have to make, and every adult should have already honored. Years later, people would still ask Marcus about the freezer camera. They wanted to know how he noticed it. They wanted to know whether he felt lucky. Marcus always answered carefully. Luck had played a role, maybe. But what saved him wasn't luck alone. It was a lifetime of paying attention. It was a notebook in a pocket. It was a wife who refused silence. It was a granddaughter who believed him before the world did. It was a lawyer who moved before evidence could disappear. It was a cashier who found her courage. And it was one small red light blinking above a freezer case, while everyone else assumed the truth had no witness. The world is full of people like Marcus. People who clean buildings before sunrise. People who count coins at pharmacy counters. People who keep receipts because they know how quickly suspicion can find them. People who are treated as background until someone needs a scapegoat. People who have learned to stay calm, not because they feel no anger, but because they know their anger will be used as evidence against them. And the world is also full of people standing nearby with carts and baskets, deciding whether to look away. That is where justice often begins or dies. Not only in courts, not only in statements, not only in viral clips. It begins in the small human moment, when someone sees a person being judged too quickly and decides that comfort is not more important than truth. It begins when a cashier speaks, when a shopper records, when a worker preserves a file, when a family writes down the time, when someone refuses to let the first version of a story become the only version. Marcus Hale did not set out to become a symbol. He set out to buy groceries, medicine, and one blue cupcake for a child he loved. But the people who tried to humiliate him forgot something that powerful people often forget. Quiet people are not empty. Tired people are not careless. Poor people are not proof of guilt. And a man who has spent his life protecting records knows exactly where truth likes to hide. So if you remember anything from Marcus's story, remember this. Never decide what a person is before you know what happened to them. Never mistake someone's silence for weakness. Never assume dignity disappears just because a crowd refuses to see it. And when the lie is loud, rushed, and confident, look for the small thing still blinking in the corner. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a receipt, a notebook, a witness who finally speaks, and a forgotten camera that refuses to look away.